slowly redone tremendous wealth in that part of the world by certain countries, and just a small part of that, what they make will do wonders for Gaza. And I think you're going to see some tremendous countries stepping up and putting up a lot of money and taking care of things. But there's tremendous spirit like I haven't seen. And even the news, I won't call it fake news for this purpose, because they really were very fair today, I must tell you, in all cases. But they covered it very well. They covered it very fairly. Everybody loves it. Everybody. People that tremendous spirit, give us a fair shake. Frankly, they can't even believe it. They're amazed by it. A lot of people are. But it was just everything came together. I think the attack was very important on Iran. Because let's say that didn't happen, they'd probably by now have a nuclear weapon, numerous nuclear weapons, and therefore even if we signed a deal, there'd be a big dark cloud over it, and it wouldn't be the same thing. So Iran's different. Iran wants to work on peace now. They've informed this, and they've acknowledged that they're totally in favor of this deal. They think it's a great thing. So we appreciate that, and we'll work with Iran. As you know, we have major sanctions on Iran and lots of other things. We'd like to see them be able to rebuild their country too, but they can't have a nuclear weapon. So I want to express my tremendous gratitude to the leaders of Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey for helping us reach this incredible day, and for being there. They were there with us all the way. And of course, as you know, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and so many. I will tell you, President Erdogan was personally involved in dealing with Hamas and some of the others. He's been great. They've all been really amazing. Indonesia's been amazing. Indonesia's been fantastic. The whole world has come together for this. People that didn't get along, people that didn't like each other, neighboring countries that frankly didn't like each other. But now there's this moment in time. So we look forward to welcoming the hostages like you can't believe home to their families, and that'll take place early next week. Monday or Tuesday. And all Americans should be proud that didn't like our country, neighboring countries. A terrible conflict to an end. And I want to thank some of the people. JD, you were fantastic, and Pete, you were great. Marco was fantastic. I mean, some of you were very much involved. I'm looking around. So indirectly, I think almost everybody in this room was involved. Susie, I want to thank you very much. You were incredible. You've done an incredible job. And yes, John, what you've done was invaluable. CIA, John Radcliffe, has done an incredible job. So I want to thank you all, and if I'm missing anybody, I apologize, but you've been amazing. And then you have Steve Witkoff, who worked so hard. And you remember we settled seven. This is number 8. We settled 7 wars, or major conflicts, but wars. And this is number 8. And the one that I thought would be maybe the quickest of all would be Russia, Ukraine, and I think that's going to happen too. But in the meantime, they're losing about 7,000 people a week, and that seems pretty bad. They're losing mostly soldiers, young soldiers. They go out to war and they're getting killed. And while it doesn't affect us in a lot of ways, we've got a big ocean in between. You don't want to see that happen. It was a big mistake. That war should have never happened. It would have never happened if I were president. So we're here this morning for a cabinet meeting as my administration continues to deliver for the American people, despite the radical left lunatics that shut down our government. Democrats that they've lost their way. They have no leadership. We don't even know who to deal with over there. At least they know who to deal with. We have no idea who we're dealing with over there. They have no idea what they're doing. Republicans have voted repeatedly to pass a clean, nonpartisan bill to reopen government at the same funding levels. We're not going to do anything only good for health care. We're really, I think, become the party of good health care. And they keep using healthcare as a cudgel. Want to try and get everyone thinking about healthcare. We're the ones that are saving healthcare. In fact, one of the things we're doing is we're going to be reducing the cost of medicines by 100%, 200, 300, 500%, and even more than that, because as you know, we're in the process of favored nations right now. We've exercised a clause because we were subsidizing the entire world. The entire world pays a fraction of what the United States has been paying. And we've already numerous Pfizer and other companies have already signed, and other countries are a bigger problem because they've been getting a subsidized rate. We've been paying for years. This has gone on for 30 years. We've been reducing the rate of drugs for other countries because we've been paying much more than we're supposed to. And they used all sorts of ideas like research and development. I said, what about Germany? What about these other countries? Aren't they paying? No, we have to pay research and development. It was all nonsense, and I couldn't listen to it anymore. So it's a very radical, big, tough shift. Very tough. We had a lot of things going on there. But and you probably heard me say this in my first term. I think it was my third year. We reduced drugs from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And I was so proud of it. I actually had a news conference to announce it, and it was 1/8 of 1%. Think of that. Which barely a reduction, but it's the first time in 28 years that there was a reduction in drug prices for the year. So from the beginning to the end, it was 1/8 of 1%, and I was so proud of myself. I did something that nobody else could do. But when I started to think about it, I said, doesn't make sense. And then I'm starting to look at numbers where a pill or a treatment or some pharmaceutical product is selling in Europe for 10% of what we pay for in New York City or in any one of our places and cities, states. And then I see people leaving for other countries to go buy their pharmaceuticals, where they make journeys to various other countries, including Europe, where they got the best bargains of all. And I put an end to it. It's over. And now we're, in major, with the countries, a couple of countries said, we won't do this. I said, well, it's unfair that we're paying 10% and, you action of what we're paying for the same product made in the same plant. And they said, well, we're not going to do it. I said, that's okay. You don't have to do it. But I'm going to put a tariff of 9% or 7% or whatever the amount of money is, and I'm going to put a tariff on your country for the amount of money that you're taking advantage of us for. No, you can. I said, yeah, I can do that. I'm going to do that. And they would immediately agree. And I'd make the tariff substantially more than the number we're talking about. And they would immediately agree. So we have the consent, I think, Bobby, of every country, essentially. They know that if they don't do it, we're going to put a tariff on for double the price, and then they're going to do it. So we never had that before. You never had anybody in here that knew what the hell they were doing, I'll be honest. It really makes me angry, because for years and years, and this started many years ago, and basically we subsidized the world. So this is going to have a huge positive impact on Medicare, Medicaid, even Social Security. But anything where there's pharmaceuticals, drugs involved, it's going to have a tremendous impact. So we're going to get drug reductions of 100%. I told you 1/8 of 1% that I was proud of myself. Now you're going to get 100%, 150%, 200, 300, 400, 500%. You're going to get the biggest drug reductions that you've ever seen. And they're already, I guess they're starting to kick in, but we've made deals with numerous companies and we're going for the full bore. We want whatever the price is. So that would mean that the world price, because the world is bigger than the United States, a lot more people, but the world price will go up a little bit and our price will come down a lot. So if a pill sells for $10 in London and $100 here, the pill will go to $20 in London and $20 for us. It's pretty simple. And that is a number that nobody can even fathom. It's a little like tariffs. Nobody knew how big they were. Nobody knew until they started seeing the trillions of dollars that have come in. I don't know why they didn't understand it. It's something they should have understood. We were taken advantage of for years with tariffs, and now I don't want to say we're taking advantage, but we've become a very strong country because of the money that's coming in. Republicans have voted repeatedly to pass a clean, nonpartisan bill to reopen our government. And remember, at the same funding levels, both parties have supported in the past. So the radical Democrats have chosen to put the economy of our country. We have the best economy we've ever had. We had the best economy in my first term, but we have an economy that's blowing it away. And we have the Democrats that are trying to obstruct. They don't want to have a good economy. I don't think they want to have a good country. That's why they try and stop our law enforcement from doing what we did in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., we have a great, safe, beautiful capital right now. Beautiful. It's so safe. You can walk down the street. Numerous people standing before me were mugged. And you're not going to get mugged anymore. We have a safe capital, one of the safest. That's not leadership, you know. The only one that challenged her actually was Nancy Pelosi. Nancy's not looking too good. I don't know what happened to Nancy, but she's not looking great. But she was the only one. I give her credit. She was the only one that challenged her. But AOC said that they can come to her office and negotiate, the Republicans, and we're saying, oh, I didn't know she was in leadership, but she's taking Hakeem Jeffries' place, and Schumer's afraid that she's going to run against him. And right now, I don't know. It can change. Life is crazy, right? But right now, he can't beat. I don't think he can beat anybody. So he'll lose in a primary. I would say he'll retire before he loses in a primary. So I think Schumer's going to retire because he can't beat anybody. His polls are so bad. Meanwhile, the Democrat shutdown is causing pain and suffering for hardworking Americans, including our military, our air traffic controllers, and impoverished mothers, people with young children, people that have to live not the greatest of lives. But we're doing so many tax cuts. We've cut their taxes. The great big beautiful bill, we've cut their taxes at levels that nobody's ever seen. I mean, no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime. It's been a great thing for a lot of people. They're doing great. Despite all of the damage that it's caused, the shutdown has been, pretty damaging. I mean, it's not yet because it's early, but it gets a little bit worse as it goes along. And we'll be making cuts that will be permanent. And we're only going to cut Democrat programs. I hate to tell you. I guess that makes sense. But we're only cutting Democrat programs. But we're going to start that. And we have Russell can talk to you about it if he wants to. But we'll be cutting some very popular Democrat programs that aren't popular with Republicans, frankly, because that's the way it works. They wanted to do this, so we'll give them a little taste of their own medicine. But Chuck Schumer proclaimed this morning that every day gets better for them. No, every day it's actually getting worse for them. And they're having a rebellion in the Democrat Party because they want to stop. And if you saw all of Schumer's, I watched last night like 10 different times over the years, he said, you can't shut down government, you can't shut down, and now he's the one that shut it down. So this is a confession that he's acting not to serve the people, but to serve the partisan interests of his party. And I don't think he's serving them well because they're way down. Look, they just lost an election in a landslide. You know, it was interesting. I watched Kamala. It was a sad figure. I watched her the other day saying the election was very close. I said, no, the election was a landslide. We won the popular vote by millions. We won the Electoral College by, I think, 312 or 315 to 220 something. But there's another one that we won that's why when you see the maps are completely red. It's counties. The counties, we won at 2,505 to 525. So 2,500 to 525. That's called one of the biggest landslides in history. And that's one that people are using now as a primary. But literally, when you see it colored in, the entire country is red, representing Republicans. So, you know, they go around, they just lie. And everything's a big lie with them. Well, the other side, and the other thing I don't understand is, Christie, I looked at crime numbers in Chicago. They're through the roof. And I have a governor who stands up every day and tells us how wonderful Chicago is. Just a lie. It's like a con job. It's like Gavin Newsom. He says how well he's doing in California, and they're doing terribly. Population's getting smaller. People are leaving. And other people are coming in. And, you know, I wouldn't say it's an even trade. While the other side is focused on playing games, the Trump administration is focused on creating jobs, bringing down prices, and we've really brought them down a lot. That's the other thing. We're bringing down prices a lot. We're bringing down grocery prices, but the big thing is energy. When you bring down energy, everything comes down, and the energy prices are way down. I see we're down to about $61 now a barrel, and gasoline's going to be, I think gasoline's going to be below $2 at some point in the pretty near future. It's very low, much lower than it was under Sleepy Joe. And we're restoring law and order in our country. We're restoring it here, but we're restoring it right now. We're in Memphis. We're going to Chicago. We're going to other cities. Many governors are asking us to, including Democrats are trying to ask. I don't know what the big problem is. If I were a Democrat governor, I'd be saying, whatever you can do to get crime down, I'll take anybody. You can bring them in I don't care who it is. A lot of people said that. They interviewed women, these beautiful women in Chicago, black women with a MAGA hat, a red hat. They said, we don't care who he brings in here, but this place is really dangerous. We just want crime to stop. It's true. They don't care. You know, they don't differentiate between the National Guard and the Marines. They don't care. They'll take anybody. And that's the way it is. I mean, they want what we did in D.C., they want to happen to them. And it's happening in Memphis already. I see in less than a week, the numbers are really good. And it'll be great, and we'll fix that. We'll go to various other places, and we're going to be stopping crime in our cities. And that's a great thing, and we won't get credit for it, but it's a great thing. We've launched a historic campaign to take back our nation from the gangs and the street criminals, violent repeat offenders, illegal alien lawbreakers, domestic extremists, and savage, bloodthirsty cartels. And very little, by the way, is coming in by water, in case you haven't known. The drugs aren't coming in by water. In fact, we can't even find any boats in the water anymore. We had boats, we were like a subway train loaded up with drugs. Every single boat that you see getting taken out kills 25,000 Americans. Think of that. Because it's pretty tough stuff, but it kills 25,000 Americans. So when you hear that, it's no longer tough. But here in Washington, we've deployed federal law enforcement and National Guard to restore public safety, and we're working to replicate that in numerous places all over the country. And we have a very powerful military. We have a very powerful National Guard. I want to thank the governor of Texas, who has been, as usual, great. Governor Abbott, he gave us 400 troops without even a question. And we have other governors likewise doing what has to be done because they know we have to confront crime. We're directly confronting the sinister threat of left-wing domestic terrorism and violence, including the terrorist group Antifa. You saw that yesterday. We had a news conference. Antifa's out of control in Portland and other places, but mostly Portland in the case of Antifa. we had people that were really badly affected by them. It was terrible. So one of those things, but we're knocking the hell out of them. And we're looking for the people that are funding them, and those people are going to be just as guilty as the people that smack people over the head with a baseball bat. And I'd like now to ask Attorney General Bondi and Secretary Noem to discuss this a little bit and tell where we are. And then we'll go around the room. We'll go quickly. We're going to go quickly if we can, because we have a lot of things to do, including I won't be spending that much time here because I'll be leaving fairly soon for the Middle East. And I'm very honored to be involved with that, I'll tell you. It's a great thing for our country. People are so happy about it. I've never experienced anything quite like it. I've never seen such universal praise for being able to do something. No, it's something that nobody thought was possible, and we're going to end up having peace in the Middle East. Who would have thought? So, Pam, could you start, and then Christy, please.
Sure, President Trump, and despite the Democrat shutdown of our government, our law enforcement officers are out there working without paychecks, round the clock, to keep and make America safe. Secretary Hegseth and I were recently in Memphis. We had 1,100 law enforcement officers in one room with us. The Memphis PD, they were the happiest to see us, don't you think, Secretary Hegseth, of anyone. We had ATF, DEA, FBI, U.S. Marshals. I'm not sure if our park police were there. We had Treasury, Secretary Bessent, and of course we had Secretary Noem's Homeland Security, all working together with the Guard. They were so happy to have us there. We've been making arrests left and right. So far we made 562 arrests and seized 144 illegal guns just in the short time we've been in Memphis.
And many of these people are career criminals. And when you take them out of a place, your crime rate just goes down. These people commit crimes every single day. They're sick. And we're taking them out. In some cases, we're bringing them back to their countries where Biden allowed, with the stupid open borders that we had in our country, to come in. But they're being brought back to other places, or they're being put in jail, but they're career criminals.
President Trump, last night alone, we made 91 arrests, 19 firearms off the streets, and one was a warrant for a homicide, and 4 sex offenders who had active warrants. One was a sex offender on a child. Everything we did in Memphis was worth it, in my opinion, for that one arrest. Think about that. We got a child rapist off the streets, but yet we've made 562 arrests and still going strong in Memphis. Just what we did in D.C. But it's because it's all of us. It's a team working for you to make America safe, all together, around the clock.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pam.
Thank
You're doing
you,
a great
President
job.
Trump.
And it's amazing that we're not getting cooperation from Democrats. It's like, it's a new issue. You know, we have all the old issues of the wall and the border and all of the things, men playing in women's sports, they still want that, transgender for everybody. All these issues are so crazy, but we have a new one. It's called crime. We stop crime, and they allow crime. They want crime. It doesn't make sense. I think it's as ridiculous as the other things that we talk about all the time. But I've added it onto our list, a 5-letter word called crime. We stop it, and they actually incite it. It's crazy. You would think they'd want them. You'd think they'd want Christy and Pam and all of the people. If we needed the military, Pete will be there. We've got a massive military. We have the best numbers we've ever had for recruitment. We have a lot of people now. We have people that can't get into them. In a great economy, they want to be soldiers again. A year ago, they didn't want to even think about it. Same thing as with police and firemen, everything. They want to join. They're proud of our country again. Christy, go ahead, please.
Well, sir, thank you for your leadership and for deploying all of government to help us keep our country safe. You have talked extensively about how threatened our ICE officers are, but all of our law enforcement out there. And we saw the shooting in Dallas at that facility, so we're hardening all of our buildings and making sure that we have more security measures, snipers on the roof, people to protect our law enforcement while they're out there on the streets. But what I'm also doing, sir, is, and with your authority, is we're purchasing more buildings in Chicago to operate out of. We're gonna not back off. In fact, we're doubling down, and we're gonna be in more parts of Chicago in response to the people there. And then I was there a few days ago and looked at some facilities that we can deploy more law enforcement out of. Because what they're trying to do with these riots and violence is distract us and keep us from going after those murderers and rapists that are out on the streets. And then I was in Portland, went out and back on Tuesday, and met with the governor, met with the mayor, met with the chief of police and the superintendent of the highway patrol. They're all lying and disingenuous and dishonest people, because as soon as you leave the room, then they make the exact opposite response. So we're looking at new facilities to purchase. They're in Portland too, and we're going to double down. And I told them if they didn't meet our demands for safety and security on the streets and work with us, then we were going to bring in more federal law enforcement. So I want to thank Pete and the Department of War for all their help. They've been fantastic, but while we fight litigation and work with Pam on that, we're going to send more of our resources and men and women out there to keep everybody safe. So no worries. What we see in DC and what we see in Memphis for benefits for people in the safety and security, we'll see that in Chicago and Portland.
The numbers in Memphis, it's only a week, but the numbers have been amazing, I understand.
That's exactly right.
The crime numbers are way down.
Fantastic, and it shows what a partnership can be between local law enforcement and the federal government. And if we have to do it the hard way in Portland and Chicago, we will. But the people demand the safety.
My lawyers are in court right now as we speak for you, arguing in Chicago and Portland to keep them safe, to bring in the guard. The government doesn't want it there, but we do. We're going to keep their citizens safe, thanks to
The
you.
people want it. I don't understand the politics of it. I don't understand why Pritzker is trying to protect people that are really bad
They're
people.
more scared of the anarchists that are on the street and the politics of it than they are of doing the right thing.
I think they're afraid.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
they're
they're
scared.
threatened. They don't tell us, but I think Pritzker's threatened by people. There's no other reason that this could be possible, that they don't want to have a safe Chicago. And we can solve the problem very quickly. And we're doing that anyway, regardless of if he doesn't want it or if he does want it, we're doing it anyway. So make sure.
I asked the mayor that himself. He said that Portland was perfectly safe, a beautiful city, no problems. And I said, well, why did you clear the streets for me today then and build out a 4-block radius to make sure I could get in and out of here? And these people on the street screaming death to ICE. There's graffiti that says Molotovs melt ICE. We have the guillotines. We're going to use them. The things that
Almost different. It's like anarchists.
It is. It really
You know,
is.
it's really different than a lot of the others. This is a sick situation, but those are anarchists. Those are people that want to overthrow government. They're really degenerates. And we're finding out who is supplying all of those beautiful signs and everything
Well,
else.
Scott's been fantastic. His team finding the financial networks is great. That's what gives everybody.
Scott will do that. That's easy for Scott. Right?
We got a great team, sir.
That's good. How about we go to Marco? You can talk a little bit about what's going on, and
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, Mr. President. I don't know if one day perhaps the entire story will be told about the events of yesterday, but suffice it to say, it's not an exaggeration that none of it would have been possible without the President of the United States being involved. It really began with your trip to the Middle East, where these relationships were forged with partners in the region, personal relationships, close relationships that created the foundation where all of this was possible. Where I think this really took a turn. Remember, a month ago, no one thought this was possible. Where it really took a turn about a month ago, less than a couple weeks ago, is when we were at the United Nations and you convened an historic meeting, not simply of Arab countries, but of Muslim majority countries from around the world, including Indonesia was there, Pakistan was there, and created this coalition behind this plan. Then on that following Monday, you met with the Prime Minister of Israel here, and that plan was presented. And then, of course, our great negotiating team followed up on it. In the interim, again, perhaps the stories will be told, perhaps they will never be told. The President had some extraordinary phone calls and meetings that required a high degree of intensity and commitment, and made this happen. And I think what's important to understand is that yesterday what happened was really a human story. There's a geopolitical aspect to it, there's no doubt about it. It creates the conditions for Gaza to one day be a normal place again and people to have a better life and Israelis to be safe. But yesterday was a human story. And because of the work you put in, and honestly, not only is there no other leader in the world that could have put this together, Mr. President, But frankly, I don't know of any American president in the modern era that could have made this possible because of the actions you have taken unrelated to this and because of who you are and what you've done and how you're viewed. And this weekend, because of that, at some point very soon, we are going to see 20 living human beings emerge from the darkness into the light for the first time in 2 years. And that is because not only were you used the credibility and the power and the prestige of this office and the relationships you created, and you committed yourself to making it happen. And I think it will go down as a historic moment in the history of our country, and something our country should be very proud of, that we have a president that's committed to the not just peace, but to the human aspect of reuniting these families. My last point on this is just a couple days ago, Secretary Lutnick hosted us all, many of us, at the Kennedy Center. And we had these families, we've interacted with them for so many years, for 2 years now. And the stories are heartbreaking, both whose families are alive and those who are deceased as well, who want their relatives back so that they can complete the process of grieving. And it was, we had all hoped that perhaps that was the day that we would have an announcement for them on the anniversary of the 7th, but I know you were able to speak to some of those families last night, and I just hope the whole nation understands how incredibly proud they should be of their president and of their country for the role that they've played. And I don't want to let this moment pass, Mr. President, without also noting the incredible work of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They're an incredible team working together, facing some substantial impediments to even being there this weekend and doing it. Let me just leave it at that. And they've done a great job on your behalf, Mr. President. They deserve a tremendous amount of credit. But thank you for what you've done for the world. For the world.
Thank you very much, Marco. I appreciate it. I think because we have a very busy day with all that's going on, what we'll do is maybe just a few of you raise your hand if you'd like to say something that don't talk too long, Doug. But he's doing such a great job. So good that he could talk all day. That's the problem, right? But go ahead. And what we'll do is just take a few hands, and then we'll go back to getting peace done, okay? We'll go a little bit quicker. We'll take a few questions from the press. Go ahead, please.
President Trump, I just want to double down on what Marco was sharing. It's such a remarkable accomplishment. Agree that no other president could have done this, but what set the groundwork for you able to do that? When you took office on January 20th, you made a 180-degree turn in our military strength with Pete's leadership. You were the master class in peace through strength. So militarily, we've completely turned around. We've demonstrated that through execution against Iran and others. That we have force. We want to end wars, but we'll use power if we have to. And then secondarily, peace through strength is also the prosperity, having the strongest economy and being willing to wield the power of a tariff in addition to the military power to reorder the globe. Those two things that you're standing on, both economic power and military power, allowed these negotiations to go forward. And I think as you've described the importance of these economic negotiations and all the trade deals, but that also begins with another 180-degree turn, and that was the 180-degree turn on energy. You have used energy diplomacy to bring prosperity to the American people, and you've used it to bring peace abroad. The combination of those three things have been remarkable, and now we're seeing the remarkable result. And we got one more that I know you want to end with Russia and Ukraine. Energy is going to play a key role in that, and now with this historic agreement, we're in a position working with the Middle East to also end the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So again, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate it. Maybe I'll go to you for a second. You can just cap out what he said about the military, how well we're doing, and how big it is, and how strong it is.
Mr. President, you're exactly right. At the War Department, you don't get peace without strength, and our job is to be the strength part of the equation and deliver that when necessary, as you demonstrated with your order of Midnight Hammer, and the entire world saw. And I just want to echo what Marco said. It is a personal honor to be able to witness the way you lead and negotiate. I wish people had a full understanding of what that looks like, that historic nature. A lot of us vets, the Vice President, Tulsi, Lee, Doug, probably after decades of war and the chaos that was unleashed through reckless and foolish American policies, never thought this kind of peace would be possible. Yet, with your strength, with your ability to wield trade negotiations, personal relationships, to open up that opportunity is truly historic on the world stage. And it creates a whole number of other cascading effects. And watching Marco and the Vice President and Steve and Jared, the CIA director, everybody come together to make it happen. You've formed a phenomenal team, Mr. President. And at the War Department, our job is to make sure if and when there's question about American commitment, the whole world knows we've got the biggest, strongest, most lethal, and most ready War Department in the world, which is true, which is why we saw record recruitment in 2025, Mr. President. The first 2 weeks of 2026 already blows that out. FY 2026 already blows it out of the water. In fact, re-enlistment has already met its year-long goal in the Marine Corps in 2026. In 2 weeks. Okay? You can't, there's no other way to create that kind of love and enthusiasm than with your leadership, sir. And it is an honor to work with Pam and with Christy and the cities across the country to make sure American citizens and law enforcement are protected with our National Guard. That's a core mission. And last thing, Mr. President, on the southwest border, the first group that rotated in to lock down that border to 0 crossings is now rotating out, and with a new border medal, the Southwest Border Medal, or it's actually called the Mexican Border Medal, revived from 1918, that will be pinning on their chest. So thank you for renaming the department, and we're trying to live up to it every day. Thank you, sir.
I mean, think of this. We have record numbers of recruitment. 1 year ago, there were stories, front page stories, that we couldn't get anybody to join the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. My beautiful, I call it our beautiful Space Force. I love our Space Force. It's turned out to be very important. But we couldn't get anybody to join. Nobody wanted to join, including our police and fire. They didn't want to join anything. Recruitment was embarrassing. We couldn't get anybody. And now we're brimming. Now it's, and they're getting in based on merit now. A soldier's a soldier. They come in now based on merit, not based on woke stuff that anybody can qualify. You have to qualify for jobs. You have to qualify for certain types of jobs. And it's amazing. So we were embarrassed a year ago. Think of it, a little bit more than a year ago. I think it stopped on November 5th. I think it really started, this all started on November 5th, the election day. But now everybody wants to be in. We have an overabundance, and maybe we should raise it a little bit. I don't know.
I like that idea, sir.
But we could raise it. But we have so many people want to join, and they're proud of our country again. JD, could I ask you to say a few words?
Yes, sir. So just a couple of things, Mr. President. First of all, congratulations on yesterday. It was a big day to Marco, to Susie, to the entire team. But in particular, viewing it from this perspective, where for months the fake news media attacked you, attacked the entire team, attacked your approach. You know, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing again and again, expecting a different result. The reason we're here is because the president actually charted a different course with a different team. He vested a lot of authority into Steve Witkoff in particular, and that's why we're here. It's because you did something different, and I think it's important to recognize that. I also think the president, you know, Marco mentioned the president's personal touch being a big part of this. You know, the one thing I would say is obviously the president of the United States, a New York real estate billionaire, one of the most famous New Yorkers in the world, has a lot of interaction with a lot of people who are very pro-Israel. I think that was an important set of experiences and life experiences that he brought to the table. He also, of course, knew one of the most famous Palestinians in the world, Chuck Schumer, and I think without that background of knowledge, it would have been impossible to get us to this. Second thing I want to say, just on Chuck Schumer, the president mentioned this, that Chuck Schumer said this has been very good for us this morning about the shutdown. One of the things that we talked about before all the media came in, and that all of us are going to work on for the rest of the day, we've been working on for days, is how to make the shutdown as painless as possible on the American people. So while Chuck Schumer brags about this being good, and I think the president is right, it's not good for him politically as much as he might think that it is, it's causing real consequences for the American people. There's a low-income food program, the WIC program, that my mom actually used when I was a baby. That program is about to be underfunded, and it's about to get cut off because Chuck Schumer won't open the government. We have troops. The Secretary of War mentioned how well we're doing on recruitment. We're trying to figure out how to pay our troops because Chuck Schumer is shutting down the U.S. government. There are veterans benefits that are going to suffer. There are Americans that are going to suffer because Chuck Schumer refuses to do his job. So while we're all celebrating this incredible success that we've had on the world stage, the country could be doing so much better if Chuck Schumer did his job and opened the government. Every single Republican, except for Rand Paul, has voted to open the government. A few moderate Democrats, to their credit, have voted with us to open the government. We just need 5 more Democrats to come to their senses and let the people's government serve the American people. I hope that they'll do that.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
sir.
Chris, please.
Yeah, to follow up on that point, Mr. President, the Democrat or Schumer shutdown did not begin 8 or 9 days ago. It began 8 or 9 months ago with your inauguration. For the first time in American history, every Senate confirmed appointee who are our deputies to run our department, every one of them has been filibustered. One of the critical parts of my department is the National Nuclear Security Administration. It maintains, manufactures our nuclear weapons and our engines for nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers. We are a key supplier to Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. They filibustered, the Democrats filibustered the leader, the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, would not let him come into my department until the Republicans 2 weeks ago changed the Senate rules so they could confirm him and we could have a leader. They filibustered the leadership, now they're filibustering the funding. In the next 6-7 days, we're going to run out of funding, and the retooling of our nuclear stockpile, the ultimate guarantor of our sovereignty, is going to be underfunded, and we're going to have to slow down and creep to us crawl these efforts. Just incredibly irresponsible for Schumer to worry about his own reelection and not the 340 million Americans that count on the efforts of our military and all of our departments. It's truly offensive, and we need to bring it to an end as soon as possible. Let's open the government back up.
And you're doing a great job. Thank you very much. Bobby, did you want to say something? You got a lot of things happening.
A lot of things.
A lot of very positive things, actually.
Mr. President, I'm glad you're getting bipartisan accolades on the Mideast Peace Agreement. You should also get bipartisan accolades on the MFN agreement. It is an historic agreement that's going to benefit every hardworking American. It's going to lower the price of drugs for every American. By the time this administration is over, we will have 95% of the drugs in this country will be the lowest price in the world. It immediately begins to affect Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, the other government programs. I remember when I went through the confirmation process, and the principal preoccupation of the Democrats during that process was whether I would continue the IRA negotiations on drugs. The Democrats negotiated 10 drugs. I'm supposed to negotiate every year 15. The 10 that they negotiated, they claimed to get a 22% reduction, but it was a lie. It was 22% under the list price, which was actually higher than the price we were getting. So Medicaid, Medicare ended up paying more for those drugs than they were paying beforehand. They only got a benefit on one drug. One was tied. 8 of them were lower. So they should be applauding what we're doing now. We're doing something that every administration, Democrat and Republican, has been saying that it was going to do for decades, and you got it done because you understood the power of the tariffs, that we had leverage over these companies. And you did it in a way which you asked us to do, to negotiate in a way that was not going to stifle innovation, that was going to make sure that those companies could bring their production home, and they are doing that. And it was a profound success. It will affect every American for 100 years. And you should be getting bipartisan accolades on that. I'll say one other thing about Tylenol, only because of this. This morning before I came in here, somebody showed me a TikTok video of a pregnant woman, 8 months pregnant. She is an associate professor at the Columbia Medical School, and she is saying F Trump and gobbling Tylenol with her baby in her placenta. And the level of Trump derangement syndrome has now left political landscapes, and it is now in the realm of pathology. And a mother could overwhelm millions of years of maternal instinct to put her baby at risk. And all you have to do is look at the studies which you and I talked about. It's not dispositive that causes autism, but it is so suggestive that anybody who takes this stuff during pregnancy, unless they have to, is irresponsible. There are 15 rodent studies. Every one of them shows if you give it to the mother, the babies, and particularly the male babies, have profound neurological and behavioral changes. There is a study from Johns Hopkins on cord blood where they divided women into 3 categories: those who had the least acetaminophen in their cord blood, and those who had the most. The ones with the most had 3.6 times the rate of autism in their children. The middle category had 2.2 times, so it's a dose-related response. And there are dozens of studies that show the countries that use the most have the highest level of autism. Cuba has the lowest level in the world of acetaminophen use, and it has the lowest autism rate in the world. So this is not dispositive. It is not proof. We're doing the studies to make the proof. But in the meantime, the precautionary principle should apply, and any mother who is taking this stuff during pregnancy just to get back at Donald Trump is doing something that is pathological. And we're seeing that across the board. I got a lot of other stuff to talk about, but I know we got a short time here. But thank you, Mr. President. You're making our country healthier again.
Thank you, Bobby. Could you just, for the record, state what the autism was, let's say, 20 years ago and what it is today?
In 1970, the largest epidemiological study in history was performed. 900,000 kids were looked at. They were looking for autism in Wisconsin children. They looked at every child in Wisconsin who was 8 years old. They found an autism rate of 0.7 per 10,000. So almost close to 1 in 20,000, less than 1 in 10,000. Today, the autism rates are nationally 1 in 31, but it's actually much worse than that because California, which has the best collection system, reports an autism rate of 1 in every 19 children, 1 in every 12.5 boys. This is a national security issue. There is nothing more important, and I'm grateful to you, Mr. President, because you know the flack that you take for even talking about this issue. You've shown courage and you've shown leadership, and I can't thank you enough for letting me do this work.
Thank you. So think of that, 1 in 20,000, and now it's 1 in 12 for boys, 1 in 18, 19 for girls. So obviously there's something that's artificially, I think, induced, something, whether it's the vaccines in terms of these massive vaccines that are twice the size of a jar like that, of a glass of water like that, I mean, into a baby's body. And I've suggested get them in doses, get them in, maybe 20%, 30%, but smaller, not such a big. I think, that. Then we had certain recommendations, the MMR, take them separately. The measles is already separate now, and it works out much better, but there doesn't seem to be any impact if you take it separately. If you take it as a combination, it's not so great. And some other things, but I would say don't take Tylenol if you're pregnant, and when the baby is born, don't give it Tylenol. If you can avoid it at all, just don't give it Tylenol.
I'll say
Really,
this
what
also.
do you have to lose? You really don't have much to lose. Yeah, go ahead.
There's also there's many other confirmation studies. There's 2 studies that show children who are circumcised early have double the rate of autism. And it's highly likely because they're given Tylenol. So, none of this is dispositive, but all of it is stuff that we should be paying attention to.
But, there's a tremendous amount of proof or evidence, I would say, as a non-doctor, but I've studied this a long time ago. I met Bobby in my office 20 years ago. We were talking about the same thing 20 years ago. And I was a real estate developer. It bothered me that it seemed to be getting worse, but it's so bad now when you hear these numbers. It's not even really sustainable. I don't know how people do it, but there is some very strong evidence on Tylenol. In fact, at one point, I guess the company gave a warning.
They still don't recommend it during pregnancy. That's the weird thing.
They're not recommending it, and that's the company itself. So just don't take it. Don't take it. If you're a woman, don't take it, and don't give it to the baby when the baby's born, and I think that's going to have an impact. But I'd also get the shots in smaller doses. There are a few things, we gave a few things that just seem to be, and I think you'd get that number way back up. Think of it. You have 1 in 20,000, and now it's not even believable when you when you think that 20,000 drops to 12 children. So that's induced by something that's given or taken, and it should be able to be stopped. And you were talking about the Pennsylvania Dutch, you were talking about the Amish, where they don't take any of this stuff, and they have virtually none, right? They have no autism. So we're doing something very bad. Somebody's been given some bad things. Other countries, by the way, we have, I think, we have 82 vaccines that we give simultaneously. And I'm a vaccine believer, by the way. I believe in the polio vaccine. I believe in a lot of vaccines. But when you give 82 vaccines and a shot to a little baby that hasn't even formed yet, it's a lot of vaccines. And in Japan, they give a much smaller number. In Germany, they give a much smaller, like 28 vaccines. That's a lot too, but 28's a lot different than 82. So, but I would say on the Tylenol, don't take it, and that will be. I think it's going to be a big factor. I think it'll be a very good result, and I hope we're going to be able to see that result in the not too distant future. Because certainly, people have heard us loud and clear. That's why I bring it up again. That's why I asked you to talk about it, because this is a horrible thing, and if you don't take it, I mean, you have to tough it through sometimes. There are other things you can do, but you have to tough it out. It's easy for me to say, but I think you're going to see numbers that will be it'll be so significantly improved, and maybe fully improved. I mean, there's something there. There's something going on, and we have to address it. And so I'm addressing it the best I can as a non-doctor, but I'm a man of common sense. Okay, any other questions?
I'd like to comment on
Yeah,
the
please.
report. Mr. President, a lot of people are calling to give you the Nobel Peace Prize after this peace deal that you managed to achieve in the Middle East. First of all, your opinion on that, and I was wondering about your trip to the Middle East, if you can tell us if you're considering to speak at the Knesset, at the Israeli parliament.
Well, they asked me to speak at the Knesset, and I've agreed to. If they would like me to, I will do it. It's the first time a president has ever done that, so that makes it very interesting, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I will do it if they want me to. They have asked me to do that. Thank you.
Families of hostages are out in the streets in Israel dancing and crying tears
They're
of
all
joy.
dancing in the streets right now. They're dancing in the streets. They're so happy. Everybody's happy. They're dancing in the streets of Arab countries, Muslim countries. I've never seen anything like it. Everybody is happy. It's been really amazing. Thank you.
President Trump, on the international peacekeeping force that's going to deploy to Gaza soon, do you expect that Pakistan, Turkey, other countries to contribute forces? Has that become firmed up? And also, the shutdown, it seems like in the House there's a majority support for a temporary extension of the Obamacare subsidies, perhaps minus the funds for illegal immigrants. Is that how you see the deal to end the shutdown happening?
Well, I see the deal just getting extended as we continue to talk, but we're willing to pay because we're paying. You know, it's very simple. We're paying. And the Democrats are the ones that caused this problem. And it's a big problem for them, and they have a lot of break in their ranks. But so I see that, you know, I think that'll get worked out. But we want to get back before we do this. We don't want to have a gun held to our head. We don't like that. And the public doesn't like it either. So we want to get back. And I think it's going to work out. I think it's going to work out very well. It's something that shouldn't have happened. This was supposed to take place before the election. You know, this was supposed to take place on September 28th before the election. We shouldn't even be talking about this right now. This is actually something that shouldn't have even happened. Yeah, please.
Mr. President, looking ahead, what guarantees Hamas disarms and that Israel doesn't resume bombing once the hostages
Well, the
are
first thing
released?
we're doing is getting our hostages back, okay? And that's what people wanted more than anything else. They wanted these hostages back that have lived in hell like nobody has ever even dreamt possible. And after that, we'll see. But they've agreed to things, and I think it's going to move along pretty well.
But what is phase two? When
Well,
does
I'm
it
not
begin?
going to talk about that because you sort of know what phase two is, but there will be disarming, there will be pullbacks, there will be a lot of things that are happening. You know, I gave you a whole list of 22 different things that will take place. And I think it'll take place, and I think you're going to end up with peace in the Middle East. But we have to get our hostages back. and we weren't going to do it at the end. We're going to do it at the beginning. We said we want them at the beginning. We're not doing it. You know, we got the hostages back. We did, as a group with Steve and Jared and Marco and me and all of us. We got the hostages back. We got many of them back. Many, unfortunately, were dead, but we got many back that are now living with their families, with their parents in many cases, and with their husbands, families, wives. Many of them, they celebrate all over. They're the ones that are celebrating the loudest. They're all over. There are a lot of them that we got out. But the last 20, and I always said the last ones are going to be the most difficult. But it's been a very big deal getting the hostages out. But the rest is going to take place too.
And can you promise Palestinians they will be able to stay?
Well, they know exactly what we're doing. We're going to create something where people can live. You can't live right now in Gaza. The place is it's a horrible situation. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. So yeah, we're going to create better conditions for people. Yeah, please.
Mr. President, excuse me, what kind of security guarantees is the United States going to make for Gaza?
Well, we're going to work with very wealthy countries that love people, frankly. I know them very well. They love people, but they love Arab people, and they love Muslims, and they love, I think right now they love everybody, and they're immensely wealthy, and they're going to be involved in putting up money, and for them it's a small amount of money. For somebody else it's a large amount of money, but you know, these are the wealthiest countries in the world, and they'll be very much involved in making it as good as possible.
And what's your take now on a two-state solution, sir? Just to follow up on that.
On what?
What is your view now on a two-state solution today?
I don't have a view. I'm going to go with what they agree to.
Mr. President, given that there are some tough provisions for Israel in this agreement, are you at all concerned that Bibi Netanyahu may not continue in his post and be deposed?
That Bibi may go a little bit out of whack.
That he may no longer be Prime Minister.
Look, that's politics. It could be. I don't know. I think he's very popular right now. He's much more popular today than he was 5 days ago, I can tell you that. Right now, I think maybe people shouldn't run against him. 5 days ago, it might not have been a bad idea. No, Bibi's this has been a very good thing. I don't think he did it for that reason, okay? But I think just looking as an analyst would look at this, I think Bibi should be very popular right now. Yeah, please.
What will happen if Hamas says that it cannot locate or was not able to find all the deceased hostages' bodies within the time?
Well, we'll have to see. I think that's going to be, it's largely been answered. We know where most of them are. Actually, the bodies are a bigger problem because some of the bodies are going to be a little bit hard to find. It's a terrible thing to discuss even, but you understand, we're all people. We're grown-ups. We understand life. Nobody can understand this stuff because this could have taken place. But we have the hostages for the most part, and so I don't think it's going to be overly big. The situation with the bodies, you know, they say 28. Some are going to be a little bit hard to find, but we're going to do the best we can. Yeah, please, behind you. Yeah, behind you. Please.
Thank you, sir. Regarding Jared Kushner's role in the negotiations, can you explain a little bit about why he came on at the last minute? And then in regards to the WIC program that the Vice President mentioned, do you know when the funding that you promised through the tariff revenue will actually go through to communities? Because there's reports that WIC providers are actually setting to close down today.
Well, okay, let me just answer the Jared. So Jared's a very smart guy. He did the Abraham Accords. As some people say, the Abraham Accords, which I love the way that sounds. But he did the Abraham Accords. It was a great thing. 4 big countries joined. If I were president, if the election would have been a correct election, which it wasn't, you'd have every country in there. Maybe even Iran would have been in there, frankly. But you'd have every country in. Now, by the way, that's going to be filled up rather quickly. People want to join the Abraham Accords. And I put Jared there because he's a very smart person, and he knows the region, knows the people, knows a lot of the players. And the combination of him and Steve Witkoff and Marco and Cooper, who is, as I hear, has been fantastic. and others that were involved. JD was very much involved. I mean, we had a very smart group of people working. We had a lot of different players, different countries, and very diverse countries, very different from each other. They had certain things in common, but they had a lot of things, mostly things that were not at all common to their countries. So we had a very smart group of people. These are high IQ people. Okay, you know, I talk about how many low IQ people we have in our government. We got some real low ones, but some shockingly low. But these are very high IQ people, and that's what we want. I like high IQ people. Yeah.
Mr. President, thank you. Can I ask you about the China? You're meeting with President Xi. The Chinese have now set to put in new export controls on rare earth minerals, and they've stopped buying soybeans from the U.S. What do you hope to get out of that meeting now with President Xi?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I just heard this a little while ago before we came in, so I haven't been briefed on it. The export. I mean, look, we have the ultimate export. We have import, and we have export. We import from China massive amounts, and you know, maybe we'll have to stop doing that. But I don't know exactly what it is. Neither do you. Neither does anybody. It's a little bit soon. I just heard about it. So Scott and Howard will figure that out, and I'm sure we'll be able to handle it.
Could I ask you about the soybeans? What is the plan to help farmers? Is it direct checks? Is it tax? Have you sorted that out yet?
Well, what happens with soybeans is we're going to see more and more, I think, opening up. And part of the reason that we'll be he's got things that he wants to discuss with me, and I have things that I want to discuss with him. And one of the things is soybeans. I had a great deal with China where they would buy $50 billion worth of our farm product and manufacturing and other things, but farm product. And it was going along well. Then when the election turned out to be a rigged election and we had the wrong guy get in there, he didn't do anything about it. I used to call up President Xi every 2 weeks, or I'd call up people in China, say, you got to keep going. You're not buying the amount that you agreed to. And this went on for, you know, ever since we signed the agreement. It was a great agreement. So they used to do 15 billion, and I got it up to 50 billion, 50, and it was great. Then when Biden got in, they just never adhered to the agreement, and nobody in Biden's group, as you can imagine, did anything about it. So it just sat there for 4 years, and they didn't adhere to the agreement. And we, you know, it's hard to go back after 4 years of nobody calling them, but I used to call them every 2 weeks. I'd say, you know, you're a little low, or I appreciate it. Oftentimes I'd say, thank you very much. You are totally adhering to the agreement. But we had an agreement, they would buy $50 billion worth of our product, mostly farm product. And the farm, remember I said to the farmers, buy larger tractors and more land. And that's exactly what happened. They did well. But we do suffer. I'd like you to discuss that maybe for a second, Brooke. Sure. Very quickly, by the way.
Yes, sir.
But would you just talk about how Biden let us down? Biden, every single thing, every problem the farmer has is because Biden didn't do anything for 4 years. Go ahead.
No, I think that's right. This president has been unequivocal in his support of the farmers. First of all, in term one, we worked on it so hard and opened up markets, but especially this term. But here's what everyone has to understand. The farm economy is in a very uncertain time. But that isn't because of the current trade negotiations, although certainly the China part is part of that. But we inherited a slew of issues. First of all, as the president said, when we left Trump 1, we had an agriculture trade surplus. When we came back for Trump 2, it was a $50 billion ag deficit. That isn't everything, that's just agriculture. The second part is the cost of inputs for our farmers increased on average between 30 and 38%, but that includes fertilizer, it includes fuel, it includes interest rates, it includes labor. All of this came about under Joe Biden, a 47% increase in the cost of labor that now Secretary Chavez-DeRimmer and Noam and I are working on. Fuel is coming down, thank you. Interest rates, thankfully, are coming down. A 73% increase in interest rates for our farmers. They couldn't get loans to make sure that they could move forward. So that's all really, really important, and I think we have to realize what the president's commitment is this, that we're moving into an era of rural prosperity, of a golden age for our farmers in rural America. the trade renegotiations and the trade realignment that Jameson and Scott and Howard have led with the president's leadership is unlike anything that's happened in the history of our country. And those that will benefit the most are the original Americans, our farmers and our ranchers. The president has committed, if we need a bridge, he has talked about that to get us from the Biden years to the new Trump era. That's what we're working on every day. We've got to get the government reopened so that we can move forward on that. And once we do, we'll be able to move out a significant program to help our farmers. Long term, we have to change this hamster wheel of government. We've got to ensure that the farmers have the market to sell, and it's a national security issue and onshoring a lot of the food as well. So, sir, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I think that's enough.
Thank you, Press. Thank you, Press. Let's go. Thank you, guys.
The country is doing very well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Press. Let's go. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey guys, this is Senator Jon Ossoff in Georgia, and please hear me out because I'm the only Democratic
called me throughout the night with info about black blockers assaulting the president to be able to end. The basis on which the district defined the term to mean a deliberate activating the National Guard in Illinois, which all
document signed by the president.
So I think there are a series of writings that the court can look to here. The first point that I would make is the statute doesn't actually require any writing, contemporaneous or otherwise, in order for the president to be able to invoke this statute. But there is here, there's the June 7th memorandum, there is the post on Truth Social on, I believe it was September 27th, stating that the president was responding to a request that had been made by the Department of Homeland Security. Security sent requesting assistance in Portland. There are further posts on social media in early October, further explaining the president's basis for the decision he made in late September. And then last, there is the recent memorandum activating the National Guard in Illinois, which also references the basis for the activation in Portland.
My second question is, under the second prong of that statute, what is the meaning of a rebellion?
So the meaning of rebellion would be the plain meaning of that term that existed at the time this language was enacted. It was enacted in 1903. And so there are contemporaneous dictionaries. I think one defined the term to mean a deliberate, organized resistance by force and arms to the laws and operations of the government. That's from Black's Law Dictionary in 1891.
Counsel, can I ask about that? You're right that the current law was 1903, but it goes back to 1792. I mean, it seems like rebellion in this series of statutes would have a sort of developed meaning. Would it be improper to go back to earlier dictionary definitions or historical examples in analyzing the meaning of rebellion?
Oh, I think that would be perfectly proper, Justice Nelson, to look historically how the term was understood and what are the historical examples in which that language had been invoked to call up the Guard. And the key example here is, of course, the Whiskey Rebellion, which refutes the basis on which the district court held here that there was no colorable factual basis for the president to conclude that there was a rebellion or danger of rebellion, because the court said there was no basis to conclude that any violence in Portland was aimed at overthrowing the entire federal government. Of course, no dictionary definition of the term rebellion requires that it be aimed at overthrowing the entire government. That wouldn't pick up historical circumstances like the Whiskey Rebellion. And I think it would lead to some pretty untenable results. For example, if you had a state governor who activated the National Guard and ordered them to shut down every ICE facility in the state, the president couldn't say that's a rebellion against the authority of the government and activate the National Guard, because that's not aimed at overthrowing the entire government.
My next question is regarding the third prong of the statute, and what is your view of the meaning of the phrase "the regular forces"?
So I think the regular forces are the forces that ordinarily enforce the laws that are at issue, and that the president has concluded the regular forces are unable to enforce. Here, I think that would be the officers of the Department of Homeland Security and Federal Protective Service.
Does that include local officers, local police officers as well, or only the federal officers?
I do not think that would include state and local officers. They are not charged with executing federal law. I think this is a statute that's solely focused on the federal forces that are at the president's disposal to execute the laws.
I just want to follow up on that. The section that immediately precedes 12406 is, of course, 12405, which appears to conjoin the regular forces as meaning the Army or the Air Force. And there is from 1902, there's a Supreme Court case that appears to define the regular forces as the National Standing Professional Army. What precedent would give it a broader meaning than that?
I'm not sure. It does have a broader meaning. I suppose it could be broader or narrower, but no one here has made the argument that the president has to first bring in the Army, the Marines, or the Air Force, the actual armed forces, before calling up the National Guard. That was, of course, not the case in Newsom, where the panel held in a published opinion that subsection 3 of the statute was satisfied. And I think that would be pretty extraordinary to say that the president has to use the actual armed forces before calling up the National Guard. For example, President Nixon did not do that when there was the postal strike, and he relied solely on section 12406 to activate state National Guards to execute the postal laws. That I think would be inconsistent with historical precedent as well.
Can I ask about you brought up the Nixon example. What was the basis for enforcing the laws of the United States? You mentioned postal laws. Are there laws that require mail to be delivered in a certain time? What were the laws that were at issue there?
That's my understanding and my recollection of the executive order there was that President Nixon enumerated certain laws relating to the Postal Service and said that because of the strike, those laws could not be executed. And that was the basis for federalizing the National Guard.
And my next question, which is again for all parties to address, I hope, and that is, what types of evidence are relevant in determining whether there is a colorable factual predicate? And specifically, I'm interested in how non-local evidence is relevant. Why is it important to know what happened in Los Angeles, Dallas, or Chicago when dealing with Oregon? And also remote in time. The recent Newsom case dealt with events that predated the declaration by a day or two. So what relevance does evidence have that's remote in time?
So to address the first part of your question, Judge Graber, I think the key evidence in this case is the declarations that we submitted below in connection with our opposition to the TRO motion that set forth the violence, the threats of violence that have occurred at this facility, and the unsustainable and unsafe diversion of the government's limited protective resources that has been necessary to contain the violence there. I think you have to keep in mind.
So it sounds like you're relying on the local evidence. Am I right about that? The evidence having to do with Portland itself or Oregon itself?
Certainly, we are relying on all of the evidence, but the historical evidence from earlier this summer in Portland, for example, when the ICE facility had to be shut down for more than 3 weeks because of the violence and threats of violence, certainly informs what is the risk that the facility faces in Portland if you remove all of the protective forces that we've had to divert to contain that situation. So I think that is one of the key errors here that the district court judge made, is taking this blinkered view of the statute, where we're only looking at what's happening in Portland in the days or weeks ahead of the federalization. And to your question about why is what's going on in the rest of the country relevant, that's because the government only has limited protective services at its disposal. They've had to call in 115 federal protective services officers have been brought in from other locations and deployed to provide 24/7 protection of the Portland facility. And our declarations below explain why that is neither safe nor sustainable, that they're not equipped to deal with that.
How often is that done?
Speaking of sustainable, those folks have gone home, am I right?
No. Some of them have gone home. There are still many of them deployed there. And certainly the president can take into account the fact that they are being pulled away from their normal duty stations, they are being tied down and are not available to address the rising violence that's occurring in other cities focused on thwarting enforcement of the immigration laws. And
how often does that happen where forces are reallocated like this? Is that unusual or is that regular?
I don't have historical data on this, but I have to imagine that a diversion of this magnitude is quite irregular. If you look at the declaration from the deputy director of FBS, he says quite clearly that we are not equipped to deal with this kind of ongoing, sustained unrest. While the officers are expected to be able to respond to emergencies, they are not expected to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, which has become the norm. That declaration states that is neither safe nor sustainable. And that's, I think, something that the president can surely take into account in analyzing whether the regular forces are able to execute the laws. Judge Graber, to go back to your reference to the situation in Los Angeles, I think there are two main differences between what's happening in Portland and what's happening in Los Angeles, and neither is material to whether the president had a colorable basis, in fact, in law to invoke the statute here. Of course, one main difference is the violence was on a significantly larger scale in Los Angeles, but of course that was addressed here by the calibrated nature of the calling up of the Guard. Only 200 members of the Oregon National Guard were called up compared to the 4,000 that were called up.
How many guardsmen were actually deployed? I know that it said 3,000 or 4,000 could be called up, but how many were actually deployed in Los Angeles?
I don't know the number. I think it was in the thousands that were actually deployed. It's significantly down now. My understanding is it's down in the low hundreds at this point. But the second difference that I wanted to focus on in Los Angeles is the president there made the decision to activate the Guard immediately to deal with the acute threat. Whereas here, we first tried to manage the situation with the regular forces, and the president only activated the National Guard after it became clear that that was neither safe nor sustainable. And the way the district court judge looked at this, where she refused to consider any of the evidence from June or July or earlier in the summer and didn't dispute that the conditions may have been met to activate the Guard then, effectively penalizes the president for using the National Guard as a last resort rather than as a first resort, and I think creates a bad incentive to do precisely that.
I have one, what I think might be my final question to you, which is really for you and not for other counsel, and that is with respect to the things that the district court did consider. Are there any factual findings that you contend are clearly erroneous? And if so, precisely which ones?
I think the answer to that, Judge Graber, is no, because I don't think there is a dispute about any of the relevant facts. I think the question is whether the undisputed facts, particularly the undisputed facts in the government's declarations, suffice to establish a colorable basis for invoking Section 12406.
So let me just be sure I understand your answer. You are not contending that any of the district court's factual findings are clearly erroneous. You're contending that she should have considered additional facts or come to a different conclusion, but you're not contending that any of the findings she made are clearly erroneous. Is that a fair summary?
At least not insofar as her stating that X event occurred on Y date. We're not disputing any of that. If we're getting beyond whether certain facts occurred to what's, sort of the risk that's presented by that and whether that risk suffices to invoke the statute, I think there we're not in the circumstance where we have a factual finding. That's application of law to facts.
So
and
is the assessment of risk as distinct from the effect of the amount of risk, is that a factual finding? In other words, if someone, this is just a hypothetical. If someone says the person was driving at 8 miles an hour and that does not present a serious risk of, running over a pedestrian, is the assessment of risk that stems from the underlying fact a factual conclusion or a legal conclusion?
I think in certain circumstances, an assessment of risk could be a factual conclusion. I don't think we have that here. I think what the district court said is that future risk is simply irrelevant, that you only can look to what's actually happening. I think that clearly has to be wrong because future risk dictates what regular forces have to do now to counteract that future risk. And that is why we've had to have so many protective services officers at this facility 24/7 in a way that's neither safe nor sustainable.
Can I ask about, you've made a review, and by the way, I know you've asked for time. We'll give you enough time to answer all of our questions. It may take each of you over the allocated times. I wanted to ask about the reviewability, because you've made an argument that this is just not reviewable by the courts. And I understand your argument to be based on Martin, which has some pretty strong language that this is expressly within the discretion of the president. Newsom didn't adopt that argument. To what degree are we bound by Newsom that this is reviewable?
So I have not found any circuit precedent that speaks squarely to that question. In the East Bay case, the court said that a published panel stay decision may be binding on future panels as to the same issue. I think I can take that off the table. We have preserved that argument. We do think it's correct. I will certainly be taking a run at the Newsom merits panel in a couple of weeks to try to persuade them that that's the one part of their opinion I think they got wrong. But for purposes of resolving this motion today, I think you can take that as the law of the circuit and ask whether we meet the very deferential standard of review that the Newsom state panel applied.
Can I just ask one follow-up question on that, though? Because this is something that I would be interested in your view of the history of the statutes, because in 1792, there was some review.
Protect your dreams.
It didn't look like it was judicial
under our
review,
roof.
but there had to be a pre-clearance
American Family Insurance.
by a justice of the Supreme Court. Then in 1795, that provision was taken out. In 1831, the statute expressly gave total discretion to the President of the United States. And then in our current statute, 1903, that total discretionary language was taken out. I mean, maybe you'll make that argument in the Newsom case, but I didn't see Newsom walk through that statutory history. And it strikes me that that suggests that there might be some reviewability here based on the change between the 1831 statute and the 1903 statute.
So the reason I don't think that's right, Judge Nelson, is because I think you should compare the language of the statute as it exists today to the language of the statute in Martin and subsequently in Luther versus Borden. And it's the exact same language. The statute is structured the exact same way. It's whenever, in a set of conditions, the president may activate the National Guard. And the court in Martin said that that statute vested in the president's sole and exclusive judgment whether the statutory preconditions were met. And to the extent Martin left any uncertainty about whether that was binding just on subordinate military officials or instead also on the courts, I think that was cleared up in Luther versus Borden, where the court quite clearly applying Martin said that that was conclusive even on the courts.
So, and just one, maybe you've already answered this, but so Martin was binding in 1831. So would that language that was expressly put in the 1831 statute, in your view, would have been superfluous, and removing superfluous language in 1903, in your view, just had no effect?
I think that's right. I mean, we don't know why that language may have been removed. They may have removed it because they thought it was unnecessary in light of the existing precedent from Martin and Luther, and Congress enacted that statute in 1903 against the backdrop of those precedents. And ordinarily, we presume that when Congress takes language that has received a construction from the United States Supreme Court and replicates it in a new statute, it imports that settled construction of the statute. And for that reason, I think both as a matter of vertical stare decisis, a lower court is bound by Martin and Luther, and that is the correct interpretation of the statute because of that principle of interpretation. But again, I don't think this panel needs to get into that here. I think the likelihood of success on the merits in this case comes down to two questions that I'd just like to crystallize for the court. One of them about the law, one of them about the facts. The legal question is whether Section 12406 colorably authorizes the president to call up the National Guard when violence and threats of violence directed at federal officials and facilities has significantly impeded federal law enforcement and required an unsustainable diversion of the regular forces in order to contain it. That's the legal question. The factual question is whether the facts of record here create a colorable basis to believe that that is the situation in Portland. And I think the answer to both of those questions is quite clearly yes.
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. One is to go to the factual issues. There was a statement in Deputy Director Cantu's declaration that there are 776 Federal Protective Service officers and only 497 are inspectors. But it wasn't clear to me what that means. Does that mean that only 497 officers are available nationwide to protect federal property? Is there a distinction between the 776 and the 497?
I had understood, and I would have to go back and look specifically at the language, but my recollection and the way I'd understood that was those are the officers who have the requisite training to be able to deal with these sort of civil unrest and violent protests, and the others do not.
All right, so when he says 115 Federal Protective Service officers were deployed, you're saying that that means out of the 497 available to protect the federal building, which means roughly 25% of the officers available nationwide were deployed to Florida.
That's how I understood it, Judge Beatty. And I think that's why he also said that this is just not sustainable.
So the other question I have is more about our procedural posture. You saw the order on the administrative stay, and there is a second TRO that the district court entered after the first and after your notice of appeal was filed. And you are here before us now asking for a stay pending appeal. But don't we have the same issue that even if we were to stay the first order, the second is still in place?
There is that same issue, and I do want to be clear that the administrative stay that was granted doesn't, from our perspective, take the time pressure off
We
giving
take
a full
complex
stay
source
pending
stacks,
appeal.
often
Because what
polarized,
we need is a
and
full
boil them
state
down to
pending
the key
appeal
insights for you.
so that
Today
we
we're
can
digging
then
into a
immediately go
movement
to the
that's been around
district
for
court and say, in
decades,
light
but
of that,
has really
the district court should dissolve that second TRO, because the second TRO rests on the exact same basis as the first TRO. So if this court grants a stay pending appeal concluding that interim relief here was not warranted because the government is likely to prevail on the merits, or because there's no irreparable harm, or because of the sliding scale, or whatever, then I would expect the district court to immediately dissolve that second TRO. And if the district court did not, then at that point, I'm confident that we would be back up here again.
Well, as things...
Would you have run the time? I mean, you
Yeah.
haven't even filed a notice of appeal. What if we...
Well,
yeah,
we're not going to run out of time to file a notice of appeal. That's 60 days. The TRO is in effect for 14, so.
I have a follow-up question to that, though. We are to decide on the state of the world as it exists today. And as it exists today, one of the things that you have the burden to demonstrate here, I think, is harm, that there's harm. And if the federalized National Guard members cannot be deployed, which is the state of affairs today, what is the harm that you are suffering? I mean, even if we grant the stay right now, I guess I have trouble seeing how there is harm if nothing changes.
Well, the harm certainly is that we cannot deploy the Guard members to address the risks of violence.
That's right, but that's not because of this case at this point. It's because of the second TRO.
It's because of the terms of both of the TROs, which rest on precisely the same reasoning. And if the panel thinks that in order to establish irreparable harm, we need to bring that second TRO up for appeal now and get it consolidated, we can certainly do that. Our judgment had been that we didn't need to burden the court with that, because if the court grants a stay pending appeal here, that should be binding on that second TRO, and it should be dissolved by the district court. And so that would redress our irreparable harm.
So can I ask about the 14-day nature? That's also different than California. California didn't have the district court did not put the 14 days in there. Does that mean we need to rule before the expiration of that? I mean, do we know whether the district court is going to extend that? Can the district court extend it? If we don't rule within 14 days, does this all become moot? What's your view on all that?
So the district court has scheduled a hearing, I believe, on October 17th, which is the day before the TRO expires on October 18th to decide whether or not to extend the TRO for an additional 14 days. If the TRO does expire either on the 18th or after it's extended for another 14 days, that would render this appeal moot. Hopefully, our view is that the panel should grant the stay pending appeal well in advance of any of that, and that would give guidance then to the district court. The court has also scheduled a preliminary injunction hearing for the end of the month on October 29th. And I think if the court granted a stay pending appeal here, the court's analysis of the likelihood of success on the merits and the balancing of the equities would inform the preliminary injunction analysis and hopefully preclude the grant of a preliminary injunction, or if not, at least require the district court to stay any preliminary injunction that's granted. Otherwise, we're going to be right back up here repeating everything that we've just done.
Okay. Any other questions by my colleagues?
No.
Thank you. We'll still give you 3 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you.
May it please the court and counsel, Stacey Chaffin on behalf of the plaintiffs. The president's 12406 determinations are entitled to great deference, but that deference has a limit, and that limit is this case. Where the president's determinations are untethered from reality, they cannot represent a colorable assessment of the facts within a range of honest judgment. I'd like to take first, Judge Graber, your question about what document represents the president's determination. And the answer is that we don't know. It's very unclear what document the president relied on to authorize the federalization of the National Guard. The two documents that we do have are the June 7th memorandum, which was issued in response to the escalating ICE protests in Los Angeles. That memo is specifically referenced in the September 28th memorandum from Secretary Hegseth that mobilized the Oregon National Guard. That memo that was issued not only relies on the June 7th memo, it references it, and then it also attaches the June 7th memo. But that memo was issued 4 months prior.
But you're not suggesting, I mean, you have raised an APA claim, but you're not suggesting that we need some formal order that represents final agency action by the president, are you?
Not at this time. And we're not making arguments regarding the form of the order itself. But if the president was relying on the June 7th memorandum, that was both not relating to Portland, and it's exceptionally stale by the time that the troops or the National Guard was actually federalized in September. There's a significant deficit of time.
So under your theory, then we can't consider any of the facts because the president didn't mention them? I mean, I don't know what the impetus for your argument is on that.
Well, if the president, the June 7th memorandum, if that is the basis for the federalization of the national troops, it has nothing to do with Portland. And it only had to do with the circumstances that were happening at that time in June.
Counsel suggested, though, that the social media post that said there's war in Portland and go forth and fix it is sort of an addendum, if you will, or a direction to apply the June 7th memo to Portland. What's your response to that?
Certainly, the statute doesn't identify for us the form that the president's determination needs to take. And if the defendants are relying on a social media post, that social media post still isn't, it doesn't represent a colorable assessment of the facts within the range of honest judgment. Within that document, the president references Portland as war-ravaged, which we all know is not accurate. And then it also calls Portland under siege, also an inaccurate statement. Because these are inaccurate statements, they can't form the basis of a colorable argument under 12406.
Well, that may be true, counsel, but you're not denying. I mean, what we heard from your opposing counsel is there's really not a lot of dispute on the facts. There might be dispute as to which facts are relevant. Do you think there's a dispute of facts as to what's happened in June, July, August, September? I mean, are there points in time where you think you have a disagreement on what's actually happened with opposing counsel?
I think we disagree with the framing, but I would direct this court to the district court's findings regarding those facts. The district court found that the Portland ICE facility protests were small, less than 30 people, largely sedate and generally peaceful.
Okay, hold on. That's clearly erroneous, because there's clearly been protests that were above 30. I mean, unless you're trying to limit it to certain time periods. We have evidence in the record that there were protests as much as 200.
It was generally small. And
I think there were 3 instances where it was large over that time period. But when we're talking about how to, as you say, frame the facts, can you go on to answer my other question, which is, what is a rebellion? And, what is the standard that we should be applying?
A rebellion is an open, organized, or armed resistance to an established government or an attempt to change the government or the leader, usually through violence. That is the appropriate definition that this court should adopt in this case.
And where does that come from?
The older definitions in Webster's. And I would highlight for the court that the first time that rebellion was added was in 1861, and that was shortly after the Confederacy declared independence and the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. And it's with that context in mind that we should interpret the word rebellion. And it isn't.
What about the Whiskey Rebellion?
The Whiskey Rebellion certainly comes into play as well, but I think
could that inform our definition of rebellion, or was that the president acted under some different provision?
I'm sorry, I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I can say that the defendant's proposed definition here is so broad that it could potentially encompass a significant amount of protected speech and protest activity. In their briefing,
I mean, my concern is and that may be true, but your definition and perhaps the definition applied by the district court seems so narrow that it doesn't even comport with the vast exercise. I shouldn't say vast, it hasn't been that many, but with those incidences where the National Guard has been used or the militia has been used, it wouldn't satisfy the rebellion prong in those either.
And I can't specifically point to the situations where the rebellion prong has been utilized, but I do know that in Newsom, this court identified that both invasions and rebellions are unusual and extreme emergencies that threaten the normal operation of civil government. So it needs to be this significant, intense, large-scale situation that really, it has such a large impact on the fabric of the country. I mean, if we're comparing it to an invasion from a foreign power, that's something that goes to the heart of the safety of our country. And when it explains also why the president has deference in these circumstances, that he's expected to respond to sudden emergencies that are upon great occasions and under circumstances which may be vital to the existence of the Union. It is under that framework that we define the phrase.
We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
And if I could.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to ask you to move to my question concerning.
We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
Is relevant, particularly in terms of time. How current the proclamation or.
We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
Of June 7th. Refers to current circumstances that would justify mobilization. So what, in your view, is the appropriate time frame to be looking at for determining whether the statutory standard is met?
From a kind of larger perspective, that really is going to depend on the circumstances. And we're not asking this court to create a very specifically defined set of factors that need to be evaluated in every case. But in this case, when the president has authorized the federalization of the National Guard in Oregon, we're asking this court to look at the circumstances around when that happened.
So do we look from June 7th forward, or do we look only at September or something else?
It would make sense it's reasonable to look at around the time period when the National Guard was actually federalized. What happened in June, and we acknowledge
Isn't
that
June around the time period of when the National Guard was federalized?
It was 4 months prior, and that is significant because there can be, and there was, a very large delta between what was going on in June and what was actually going on when the president.
So could the president have, in your view, nationalized the Guard in June?
I think we'd be having a different conversation, and it would certainly be a closer call. But
And so the president loses his right to do that, in your view, because he waits to see how things turn out on the ground.
I think in the moment, the president can make the decision to manage the situation with the normal forces. And here what we have is even that situation in June. I point the court to, I think it was June 14th is probably the worst of the circumstances that happened. And that day, the threat of violence from the protesters lasted 2 hours. And it's with the use of normal forces that they could stop the kind of incursion of the protesters, push them back, and everyone kind of had the safety that was necessary with using the normal forces. That stands in stark contrast to what happened in California. In California, there was a span of 2 days where they had consistent and increasing protest activity, where they were pinning down officers, throwing concrete chunks. They used dumpsters as battering rams to breach the facility. And the next day, the confrontation lasted for another 7 hours. Protesters boxed in officers, threw Molotov cocktails, mortar-style fireworks, rocks. They blocked traffic and burned a vehicle.
But that's a little bit of the irony here, is that because the president acted in June in LA, I mean, I don't know that we have I don't know, but it seems like we don't have the same level of violence going on in LA right now. But the president acted when there was violence, and you're saying, well, if you don't hit it within a narrow window, you lose your right. That just seems unnaturally constrained. I mean, what the president did was bring in 115 FPS officials, and that has quelled the violence to some degree, it seems, but it hasn't abated it. I mean, there's still violence going on, right?
Well, what we have is the finding from the district court that the federal law enforcement officers, unaided by military forces, were capable of not only quelling the violence in June, but also preventing it through September.
I'd like to ask you about some specific facts that I don't think are disputed. So the facility was forced to close. It was inoperable for almost a month, from June 13th to July 7th. And the declarations from the director of the Federal Protective Services and the field operations director from DHS state that the facility only reopened because of a surge of 115 Federal Protective Services officers to Portland, right? So those are facts that occurred, but that the district judge didn't consider because she apparently viewed them as out of time, that this had occurred. Are those not facts that are relevant for the president to determine the threat and whether there's a threat to DHS being able to enforce the 400 laws it's tasked with enforcing? I mean, they couldn't operate a facility. I don't know that ever happened in LA. There were attempts to breach a facility. Here, a facility was actually closed for almost a month. And the record includes more than one, at least 2 attempts to burn the building down and vandalizing the building so that it's difficult for the officers to move in and out of the building and increases danger. And the building is now currently boarded up, and the city has told DHS they have to remove the boards. So that means the facility presumably will be inoperable again. So why is all of that irrelevant to the president's decision to federalize the National Guard?
Well, I'd like to push back a little bit on the reframing here. What we have is in early June, the facility was closed for 2 weeks. During
specific dates, June 13th through July 7th. That is not 2 weeks. It's about 3.5. And I think it's properly characterized as nearly a month. But the facility was indeed closed, but the district judge didn't consider it because it was in June. So if I understand your position, only things that happened like September 24th, 25th, 26th, I mean, a very small window of time, those are the only days that the president could have legally considered when deciding whether there was a threat to the enforcement of law?
Well, if we're talking about the third prong, the inability to execute laws with the regular forces, that is a current temporal requirement.
Okay, so what is your basis for saying that? Because I didn't knew some, but what is it, where is it that it says there's a they talked about the facts there, which happened to include events that had occurred in the preceding days. Here, the president relied on, according to the declarations that have been presented, on the facts leading up to the order from June, July, and August and September. So there's a period of a few months where things were unfolding on the ground. And what I think you're saying is we can't consider any of that it should only be a few days. But what is your basis for saying that?
The text of the statute is the basis. So if we look at the third prong, it says the president is unable. That is a current inability to execute with the regular forces the laws of the United States.
And is that a day by day? So that, I mean, if we said forces are allowed, and then what, we come back the next day and say, oh, well, you got it under control. Now they're not allowed. Then it goes back up. Oh, they're allowed. I mean, it just seems like such a tortured reading of the statute. I mean, I'm not even sure President Lincoln would have been able to bring in forces when he did, because he'd have to wait. You know, if he didn't do it immediately after Fort Sumter, your argument would be, oh, things are okay right now. It just seems.
What is the effect of the June 7th authorizations statement that the National Guard should be performing federal functions at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or likely to occur based on current threat assessments? So does that limit how we or how Secretary Hegseth would have had to consider what was currently appropriate?
Yes, if the June 7th memorandum is part of this court's evaluation of the president's determination, it is limited by the current situations. And I would also, again, just direct this court back to the text of the statute, which there is an expectation that the circumstances are going to be evaluated as they happen. And that makes sense because these are emergencies, these are unusual circumstances that would immediately require the president's attention and response. If these are circumstances that are so significant that they could challenge kind of the fabric of our nation, the threat of invasion, they need an immediate response. And there isn't an attempt to penalize the president for waiting. There is a requirement that the circumstances as they happen be so significant that we need to federalize the National Guard. And
actually, for number 3, I don't think that's true. For 3, it says the president with regular forces can't execute the laws. I mean, I'm sort of trying to figure out how a district court of any nature is supposed to get in and question whether the president's assessment of executing the laws is right or wrong.
Well, this court has already concluded that there is judicial review of that information.
I understand that, but it's also great deference. And I mean, here, it has to be colorable. And so when the president comes in and says, look, we've got 115 FPS forces that aren't normally in Portland and we've had to move them, this is straining our ability to execute the laws. I don't understand how you can question the behind the scenes to say, oh, no, that can't be right. I mean, we don't have a view into what laws are trying to be executed or how they're being impinged. But why isn't that colorable?
Because it's not true. Unfortunately,
it's not true that 115 FPS forces have been there since it reopened in July?
Well, we do have in the record that a lot of the surge forces were returned before the president's announcement. So I understand that these declarations kind of, they discuss the worst of the circumstances, which I understand, but they're also written by supervisors who don't work in Portland. They're from outside of the
I have absolutely no idea. The district court said the same thing. I have absolutely no idea what that has to do with anything.
Because we would direct.
You want to focus on what's going on outside and it doesn't rise to this level. But that's not what the statute says. The statute says the president can't execute the laws. That's an internal decision making. And whether there's a ton of protests or low protests, they can still have an impact on his ability to execute the laws.
But this court has said that minimal interference isn't enough to raise to the level of an inability to execute laws. And that's what we have here. We have, yes, in June, there were more intense protests, but we have the district court identifying that the normal forces were able to manage those protests, which is within the job responsibilities of FPS generally. This is what we do. They do. You have from the declaration.
But that just seems to be the wrong analysis. And the district court did this. The district court said, well, look, people who acted violently were arrested, so everything's good. But that's not what the statute says. The statute says the president can't execute the laws. And I'm just trying to figure out why we're giving, district courts the ability to say, well, this is what I see on the outside, so therefore I'm going to transfer that onto what's going on behind the scenes. And we have declarations that say that it is impeding their ability to perform their function.
We have declarations that say we're short-staffed. We're having administrative difficulties because we don't have enough people. That is not a reason to bring the military into the streets of Portland or any other city in the United States. There needs to be something more than a deficit of employees to raise to the level of such a significant incursion into the sovereignty of a state. It needs to be more, and this is the case.
Into the streets, the deployment is limited just to the protection of federal personnel and federal property. So I saw quite a bit of that language in the motions suggesting that National Guard members would be deployed to patrol the streets of Portland, which is, I don't think the government has ever said that is the intent. The idea is to protect the building so that it can remain open.
But if
federal personnel, but
what we do have, though, is a history of a very expansive and almost strained reading from the government of the district court orders. And it would, because this authorization is to protect any federal government location, any federal personnel go throughout the city to execute whatever their mission is. And there's no, as of the drafting, there's no specific limitation that they're going to only be in.
But why would we enjoin it up front? I mean, I want to be clear. I'm very sensitive to the slippery slope argument that's being made here and the slippery slope argument that's being made in LA and around the country. This is something that, clearly the founders were concerned about. There's been a lot of debate about how this should be used. So I'm not trying to diminish that. It may well be that the forces are used in an improper way, but we don't have any evidence of that right now. All we have is a document that says we have a federal facility under attack, or that violence has been, forced it to close down, and we want to protect it. That doesn't strike me as a glaring overuse on its face. Now, if what happens is what you're suggesting, that they do engage in law enforcement activities, then obviously we have another problem. But that's not even what the district court found. You couldn't find it. There's no deployment at this point.
Well, certainly. We're not talking about like the violations of the Posse Comitatus Act.
We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
But what we have is from Newsom. We know
do a
that
little
this
trolling.
court
It's called we do a
has
little
role
trolling.
in evaluating the president's determinations. There is a direction that is this court's role. This is the case, though, that represents the outer limits of the president's authorities. We have in the month leading up, not even the week, if we look at the entire month of September, the district court found there was one instance in the kind of the weeks leading up where protesters shined flashlights in the eyes of drivers. There was also,
I mean, if that's true, then I think we've got a problem, because I don't think that's what the record says. I mean, if the district court really said that's all that happened in September, then the district court's clearly erroneous. I didn't think the district court said that. I thought the district court actually detailed more than just one incident in September where flashlights were shined in the eyes.
well, Your Honor, that's the record, though. Even if we go back to
Well, we'll have to go into it, but I don't understand the record to be that for September. I understand it to have gone down, but not that there was one incident and that was it.
That's not us saying, there were certainly protests throughout the month of September, but they were, as I earlier mentioned, and the district court found, small, less than 30 people, largely sedate, generally peaceful. That's what was happening in September. So there was an incident on Labor Day on September 1st where there were increased protests. 125 people were involved in the activity. But what we have is the statement from FPS that they were not concerned with the group. That's at 46-1. This is the day when the guillotine was displayed.
Right.
But that's arguably protected political speech. There were 40 people who remained after the larger group left, and they did arrest a few. After that, you have September 2nd, completely uneventful. September 3rd, there was a drone flying. There was some altercations. Everything was managed. That's the consistency throughout the month of September. And there were occasions when there might be, a larger number of protesters, but they were generally calm and sedate. And any of the sporadic and kind of more minimal criminal activity was appropriately handled by law enforcement resources. And that's what's supposed to happen, because the situations that we're talking about, even the situations where it unfortunately could include an assault on a federal officer, that's a crime. That's a crime that was handled. They were arrested, and I understand that the U.S. Attorney's Office had 22, they're prosecuting 22 defendants. That's how this process is supposed to work. It's not that there is a protest, and then you just send in the military. This is protected speech. And for the most part, it is calm and sedate. And it is
So the drone on, I guess this is the Wednesday, the suspect got violent and spit on agents. He was arrested and booked.
That's general criminal activity that's handled appropriately by law enforcement. On the 4th, you have 20 protesters, and then there's only 15 at 8:30. On the 5th, FPS said it was a small group with low energy, no calls for service. On the 6th, there was 50 to 60 active protesters, lots of noise. They were energized, no arrests. September 7th, 7 people, low energy. September 8th, 30 people. There were an altercation between protester and a counter protester, not against the facility. It continues, and I'm happy to go through the record.
No, this is helpful. We'll have to go through it. I mean, I don't think there's any question that it's gone down in September, but part of the problem there is it's gone down largely because of this influx of other forces, which is outside of the regular use of those FPS officials. So
does the record show us how many of the extra people remain in Portland, the FPS, and how many have been sent back to?
I don't know if you heard the question. I think it was, does it show, I mean, we know that up to 115 came. Do we know how many were there of the extra FPS? Maybe this is for the,
or something. Did you not hear?
We're not hearing you very well. It's kind of getting muffled for some reason.
Well,
there you go.
Okay,
There you go.
I'm right by the microphone. Does the record show, the record is in front of us, how many of the FPS officers from outside?
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
Remain in Portland now, and how many have been sent back to somewhere else?
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
Numbers, and much of the declarations don't have dates associated with them, so it is also very possible that those officers
do a little
were
trolling.
sent
It's called we
in
do a little
June, and
trolling.
they have all returned. We have a note within the last week before the president's announcement that there was a surge of officers.
We do a
that
little
came out,
trolling. It's called we
and
do a
then
little
there was
trolling.
no responsive protest activity, and so they went back to their respective offices. And then even after, I think that they may have plussed up their numbers in anticipation of the president's announcement. But then even then there was some increased protest activity, but it went back down. And
So the answer seems to be you don't know from that we can't know from this record. And I believe counsel on the other side said, well, they haven't all gone home, but I understood him to say, saying indirectly that some or many have gone somewhere else.
certainly a lot of them have gone. And what we also know from one of the declarations is that FPS, they respond to even nonviolent protests. This is their job. They respond to potential threats, and they would use those numbers of officers to go to any kind of that exercise of speech, just in case something becomes violent. So this is squarely within their area of responsibility. And I know we continue to talk about FPS, but we haven't even talked about any of the other federal officers that are at the president's disposal. We have a ton of law enforcement agencies under the president's control. There's referencing in their declarations to circumstances, again, that are outside of what happened in Oregon, or even if there was potentially a bomb threat. Well, we don't have anything that connects the bomb threat to these protesters. And if you do, you have significant law enforcement resources, ATF, FBI, that can respond to those potential threats. That's their job. That's what they do.
The problem that I have with this argument that I'm just trying to struggle with is, the president gets to direct his resources as he deems fit. And it just seems a little counterintuitive to me that the city of Portland can come in and say, no, you need to do it differently. Now, I understand there's a statute here, and we're going to have to review that. But this goes to the level of deference that I think the president is entitled to in these circumstances. And it's not all driven. Would you agree? It's not all driven by what we see on the streets. It's also driven to some degree by what's going on behind the scenes. And you don't have a full view into that.
I acknowledge that there is certainly information behind the scenes, but we don't have that in this record, and we don't have the defendants coming forward and putting forth anything that shows that the sporadic and minimal instances of violence, criminal activity that was appropriately handled by law enforcement at Portland is part of a greater whole. I think the district court found that the defendants did not present any evidence that the sporadic violence was part of an organized attempt to overthrow the government. And that's, I think, what they're asking this court to potentially look at when you're talking about, for example, the shooting in Dallas, that somehow increases the need.
Well, that goes to your rebellion, or that goes to the rebellion designation, but that doesn't necessarily go. I mean, you don't have to have that under prong 3, do you? For the enforcement of the laws.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't understand the.
Well, I mean, enforcement of the laws, you seem to say, well, there's no attempt to overthrow the government. And I mean, that's a fight within the context of whether there's a rebellion under subsection 2. But I don't know why that is relevant to subsection 3, which doesn't have anything to do with rebellion and is just the enforcement of the laws.
Well, I agree that the Dallas shooting shouldn't be the basis to send troops into Oregon. And if we're relying on that third prong, then it certainly it doesn't make that more or less probable.
Can I add just, and maybe my colleagues have final questions too, but I don't want to focus on it, but I'm just perplexed. And I think Judge Beatty may have referenced this. So they reopened the building, they board the windows for protection. And what does the city of Portland do? They issue a zoning violation. Are you defending issuing a zoning violation, telling them to take off the boards that were put up to respond to protesters? Do you think that that was maybe ill-advised?
Luckily, in this case, it's not something that the court needs to decide to determine whether or not the president's determination was within a colorable basis or within the range of honest judgment. But what we do know is that the circumstances at the time the president authorized the troops, whatever date that might be, they didn't raise to the level that was necessary under the statute. And we would ask that the stay be denied.
Any other questions by my colleagues?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We'll have 3 minutes of rebuttal.
Thank you, Your Honors. I just have 3 quick points that I'd like to make. First, Judge Graber, going to your questions about the basis for the determination, we're not relying solely on the June 7th memo. My basic understanding is the June 7th memo was where the president sort of set out the framework and his understanding and interpretation that violence directed at ICE officers that seeks to impede their execution of the immigration laws is the sort of circumstance that can warrant activating the guard. And President then subsequently made a determination that those circumstances were satisfied in Portland. If you look at page A52 of our appendix, you'll see that's where the DHS request is. DHS said that the facility in Portland and the ICE officers and the FPS officers have come under coordinated assault by violent groups intent on obstructing lawful enforcement actions. These groups have sought to impede through violent protest, intimidation, and sabotage of federal operations. That was the information that was before the president when he made this determination in September. Second point I want to make is about the language of the statute talking about a present inability to execute the laws. Because of the violence that's ongoing and the risk of violence that's ongoing, there is a present impediment to the execution of the laws because the forces are tied down addressing that risk. We've discussed the FPS officers. It's not just the FPS officers, it's also ICE personnel. If you look at page A85.
Do you have an answer to Judge Graber's question about how many FPS, there were 115 that were there in July at least, and maybe longer. How many are there? How many were there in September of the additional?
I do not know the answer, and I do not believe the record speaks to that. The citation that the plaintiffs provide in their brief to say that some have gone home is document 4626. You'll have to take a look at it for yourself. My best recollection, I don't have that document at my fingertips, my best recollection is it referenced about 10 people going home. But it's not just the FPS officers. If you look at paragraph 16 of the Cantu Declaration, it says the situation has resulted in FPS having to rely almost exclusively on ICE special response teams for assistance in preventing the violent protesters from attacking immigration officers and the ICE facility. And he explains that their primary mission is to be out in the field, handling high-risk immigration enforcement operations. But they're now having to be diverted to protect the facility, becoming a drain on immigration enforcement as well. If you look at the Walmsley Declaration paragraph 20, pages A77 to 78, it is to like effect. The final point that I want to make is, although we do think the judge was clearly wrong to circumscribe the inquiry to what was happening in September, I think the district court also did minimize the violence in September. I just want to highlight a couple of documents that are in the record. One is that our supplemental appendix A2 to A3.
Counsel, are you now withdrawing what you said earlier, which is that you are not challenging as clearly erroneous any of the specific factual findings that the district court did make as distinct from ignoring certain things?
I'm not challenging factual findings about what she said in terms of X event occurred on Y date. There may have been other events that occurred on other dates that she didn't address. That's not, I think, an issue for clearly erroneous review. But if you look at page SA2 to 3, this is on September 28th. This is one of the police reports. It starts out talking first about how a group of these agitators attacked 2 observers, breaking the driver's window and leaving one of them bleeding heavily from the face. And then it says there were 50 to 60 protesters outside of ICE at the time. Most of them were blocking the facility's driveway in anticipation.
I've read that document. I have a different question about it. Does that not post-date the final document on which you were relying as part of the call-up? And didn't that happen after September 28th? Is the memo from the secretary?
Right, and so that's that same day addressing.
Okay, is that the final document on which you rely? And I guess my question is, can you rely on any event that postdates the mobilization to justify the pre-existing mobilization? In other words, let's say there's nothing that happens at all. This is a hypothetical. Nothing happens, but troops are mobilized, and 2 days later, there are terrible things that happen. Does that go back in time to justify, or does there have to be something at the time of the mobilization?
I certainly think this evidence is fair game because it shows...
That's not an answer to my question. Can you rely on later evidence to justify a prior authorization?
I think we can rely on later evidence to show that there was a colorable factual basis for the president's determination here, because it demonstrates the very kind of risk that can materialize at any time with this sort of violent crowd. But it's not just on the 28th. If you go back a week earlier on September 20th, this was at page A104 of our appendix. It says, another police report, FPS agents were busy tonight. There was a group of 50 at the facility. Again, once a marked car drives through, they will flip off, scream, and throw objects at the car, and in most cases run towards the car as if they are going to charge the car. FPS Will Turner called me throughout the night with info about black blockers assaulting people. I received a video from FPS about a report about a journalist who was assaulted by a black blocker with a large sword or stick. To be clear, even if these folks were still at ICE or nearby, we would not be able to address the call or make an arrest with the resources that we have. This is hardly the peaceful and sedate crowd that plaintiffs tried to make it out to be. These are violent people. And if at any point we let down our guard, there is a serious risk of ongoing violence. And at some point, the president is entitled, when his subordinates are telling him, we are overstretched, this is unsustainable, the officers aren't available to do their jobs, they're not available to surge to other places where we face violence. The president is entitled to say enough is enough and bring in the National Guard to reinforce the regular forces. We'd ask the court to grant a stay pending appeal as swiftly as possible.
Thank you. Thank you to both counsel for your arguments in the case. The case will be taken under advisement, and we'll respond as quickly as we're able. Case is now submitted.
All persons having business with the Honorable, the United States...
We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
...will now depart, for this court stands adjourned.
We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex source stacks, often polarized, and boil them down into the key insights for you. Today we're digging into a movement that's been around for decades, but has really hit the headlines recently. Anti-fascist action, often known now as Antifa. Our sources are, well, they're quite something. We've got everything from these really detailed, gritty accounts by activists in the UK back in the 80s and 90s, all the way up to current U.S. government documents, even executive orders trying to label the modern movement as domestic terrorists. So our job here is to unpack these clashing stories, look at the history, the structure, the controversies, and just lay out the different perspectives impartially for you.
Yeah, and the real puzzle, the core tension we're trying to get at is how does this kind of loosely connected social movement, I mean, people involved often say it's more an idea than an organization. How does that become the target of a major, executive level national security debate? So we'll trace it from its pretty organized and militant roots in Britain to the modern, much more decentralized form, and look at these really conflicting views on its tactics and its legal status.
Okay, let's start with that history then. Not in the U.S., but the U.K. blueprint. Anti-Fascist Action, AFA. Active mostly, 1985 to 2001?
That's right. And this militant anti-fascism wasn't new even then. It follows this tradition going back to the 1930s, like the famous Battle of Cable Street. AFA was definitely formed in that spirit, specifically to counter groups like the British National Party, the BNP, which were gaining ground.
And their approach was defined by, what was the phrase?
Physical and ideological opposition to fascism. That was their stated aim. And you have to understand, the groups they were up against, like the BNP, weren't just holding meetings. They were engaged in, violent campaigns against minorities, against working class groups.
Right, selling racist papers on the high street, attacking places like that left-wing bookshop in Liverpool. News from nowhere.
Exactly. It was direct physical intimidation, not just abstract politics.
And the sources suggest AFA was, pretty effective at that physical opposition, at least in certain areas. Liverpool's a key example, isn't it?
It really is. The BNP had been quite persistent there, despite local opposition. But then ASA stepped in. And there's this pretty striking quote in our sources, apparently from the Liverpool BNP itself, admitting they were, and this is the quote, driven underground by left-wing extremists in the mid-'80s.
Wow. So not just pushed back, but effectively shut down locally.
That was the goal. It was about physically preventing fascists from organizing and spreading their message in public spaces.
So how did they organize to achieve that? It sounds like more than just spontaneous reactions.
Oh, definitely. AFA set itself up as a militant united front, intentionally broad, bringing together mainly anarchists and Marxists like the group Red Action.
A united front.
Mm-hmm.
What held it together?
The core agreement was what they called a class perspective. The argument was basically that fascism's ultimate goal is to destroy working class power structures, unions, community groups, political parties. So from their viewpoint, only the working class had the fundamental interest and maybe the necessary strength to truly defeat it.
And they could mobilize that strength. The sources talk about some major actions.
Yeah, this was really their peak. They deliberately confronted groups like the National Front and the BNP at very symbolic, sensitive locations.
With the Remembrance Sunday events.
Exactly. At the Cenotaph in London or Clifford's Tower in York, a site with a heavy history of anti-Jewish violence, they went where fascist groups were trying to gain legitimacy.
These weren't peaceful protests necessarily.
Not always, no. They talk about actions that smashed the Nazi music network Blood and Honor, essentially driving them off the streets around 1989. And then there was the Battle of Waterloo in 1992. That was huge. The sources say over 1,000 anti-fascists mobilized for that confrontation.
1,000 people. That's serious mobilization. They were clearly focused on controlling the streets.
Absolutely. It was about physically denying space to fascist organizations.
But did that single-minded focus on street confrontation eventually cause problems for AFA itself? Because the sources show this united front eventually just fell apart in the mid-'90s.
It seems it did. There were internal conflicts, sure, maybe personality clashes, but the big split was strategic, a fundamental disagreement about the way forward.
Okay, what was the core issue?
Well, you had factions. Some, particularly anarchists, were very concerned about the organization itself, potential police infiltration. They had disagreements with groups like Searchlight Magazine, suspecting links to special branch, police intelligence.
Okay. But that wasn't the main split.
Yeah. The defining break, according to these accounts, was over electoral politics.
Ah, right, the IWCA, the Independent Working Class Association.
Exactly. After the BNP actually managed to get a councillor elected in 1993, some within AFA, particularly Red Action, started arguing that street fighting wasn't enough. They argued AFA needed to shift to build a political alternative, and they pushed for this new party, the IWCA.
And that didn't sit well with everyone.
Not at all. It completely alienated large parts of the AFA core. Many were anarchists, fundamentally opposed to electoral politics. Others argued that a united front specifically built for street action couldn't possibly endorse one specific political party without destroying the unity.
So the very thing that made them strong, that broad unity for direct action, was undermined by the move towards politics.
It seems that way. And there were other factors, too. The sources mention police tactics adapting.
Right.
Activists getting older, having families, maybe just burning out, and competition from other, possibly better-funded groups like the relaunched Anti-Nazi League.
So AFA, this organized, centralized model, it kind of faded away. because that structure couldn't hold.
Yeah, it became unsustainable.
We do a little
Okay,
trolling.
so let's
It's
bridge
called
the
we
gap
do a
now.
little
We
trolling.
jump forward a couple of decades across the Atlantic to Antifa. How does the decline of the organized British AFA
We do a little
relate
trolling.
to this
It's called we
modern,
do a little
much more
trolling.
talked about, decentralized U.S. phenomenon? And the name itself, where's that from?
Well, the name Antifa is actually much older than the British AFA. It comes from German, antifascistische Action, anti-fascist action. It was first used by the German Communist Party back in 1932, specifically to counter the Nazis.
1932. Okay, so the term itself has deep roots in European anti-fascism.
Definitely. And that history leads us to the really crucial difference today. Modern Antifa isn't an organization like the British AFA was. It's generally defined as an umbrella term. It describes a far-left anti-fascist political movement, but it's characterized as a loose affiliation of local activists. Critically, there's no designated leadership.
No central command, no membership list.
Exactly. It's more of an ideology, a set of shared tactics and goals rather than a formal group. And that makes it fundamentally different and much harder to pin down or control.
Which brings us to the symbolism, that iconic logo, the two flags. You see it everywhere now.
Right. The two flags typically overlapping, one red for socialism or communism and one black for anarchism. It visually represents that umbrella concept, different left-wing tendencies united under the banner of anti-fascism.
Okay, now this is where it gets, let's say, contentious, especially in the media. The tactics. Let's talk about the black bloc. What is that, strategically?
The black bloc isn't a group, it's a tactic. Activists dress entirely in black, cover their faces with masks, bandanas, helmets sometimes. The purpose is pretty straightforward: anonymity. It makes it harder for law enforcement to identify individuals, especially if property destruction or physical confrontation occurs.
Like during the Trump inauguration protests in D.C., January 2017.
That's a prominent example, yes. It also creates this visual image of a unified, somewhat intimidating force.
And beyond the streets, there are digital tactics too, like doxing.
Correct. Doxing involves researching and publicly exposing the private information of opponents' names, addresses, employers. The aim is often to intimidate them, cause social or professional harm, and neutralize their activities. We've seen it used against alleged white supremacists on campuses, for instance.
And on a larger scale, I remember something about ICE employees.
Yes, in 2018, an account linked to Antifa activists reportedly published personal details of over 1,500 Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, employees. The sources say this led to threats and harassment against federal agents. For some anarchist extremists within the broader movement, that level of disruption is seen as success. They might even measure it against the chaos and property damage during the 1999 WTO protests in Seattle. That's sometimes held up as a benchmark.
A sort of Seattle standard for disruption.
Kind of, yeah, for a certain element.
Okay, before we get into the whole terrorism designation debate, there's a weird wrinkle in the sources groups trying to sort of hijack this imagery.
Yes. The National Anarchists. It's important to mention them, though they seem quite fringe. Groups like BANA, Bay Area National Anarchists, apparently practice what's called entryism. They try to infiltrate or mimic left-wing anarchist movements, but their ideology is completely different. It's actually white nationalism, racial separatism. They talk about creating whites-only enclaves, national autonomous zones, they call them.
So they use the language of anarchism and environmentalism to mask essentially white supremacist goals.
Exactly. It's an attempt to co-opt the aesthetic and language of the far left for far right aims. A very strange hybrid.
Okay, so keeping that complexity in mind, let's turn to the big contemporary fight. The push in the U.S. to designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. Given everything we said about it being a loose affiliation and ideology, how did that even become a serious proposal?
Well, the political pressure built hugely, especially after the widespread protests and riots in 2020. High-level U.S. officials, and eventually an executive order signed in September 2025, started framing Antifa very differently. The language used describes it as a militarist anarchist enterprise. It explicitly accuses the movement of calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government.
Strong words. What specific actions did they cite?
The IA2 mentions using violence, obstructing federal law, specifically citing violent clashes with ICE officers, and accuses them of actively recruiting and training people. The overall claim is that they aim to achieve their goals through coercion and intimidation, so painting a picture of a coordinated violent threat.
That sounds pretty definitive. But what happens when you apply legal scrutiny? Can the U.S. government actually designate a domestic group like this?
And that's the crux of the legal debate. The short answer is currently no. U.S. law has mechanisms for designating foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but there's no analogous mechanism for domestic groups, primarily because of the First Amendment. Designating a domestic group based largely on ideology, especially one without a clear structure or leadership, raises huge free speech and association concerns. Former senior Justice Department officials warned this would be legally very problematic. You'd essentially be outlawing a political viewpoint.
Okay, so legally tricky. What about the intelligence picture? Was Antifa actually responsible for the scale of violence attributed to it in 2020?
That's also heavily disputed in the sources. For instance, an FBI Washington field office report from June 2020 apparently stated they had no intelligence indicating Antifa involvement in certain specific violent incidents during the DC protests at that time.
No intelligence connecting them. But who was involved then?
Well, intriguingly, the same intelligence reports warned about far-right extremists. They specifically mentioned calls from far-right provocateurs urging attacks on federal agents and even using automatic weapons against protesters.
So the intelligence picture was actually pointing more towards far-right instigation in some cases.
It suggests the situation was, at the very least, much more complex than just blaming one group. Attribution of violence in chaotic situations is notoriously difficult and potentially politicized.
And this idea of the state trying to define and control or dismantle an anti-fascist movement, you're saying this isn't entirely new?
Not at all. We can connect this to historical examples of states using anti-fascism for their own purposes.
Like East Germany, the GDR, during the Cold War.
Precisely. In the GDR, anti-fascism wasn't just an organic movement, it became a core part of the state's official identity. It was almost a state religion. They used it as a powerful propaganda tool. It served to legitimize the socialist state, portraying West Germany as the inheritor of fascism.
And by doing that, they could sort of excuse or ignore any Nazi past among their own population?
Largely, yes. It helped create a narrative that fascism was purely a Western capitalist problem. And crucially, it was used to identify and target internal dissenters or external enemies as fascists or fascist collaborators.
So anti-fascism became a tool of state control and legitimacy.
A very effective one, for a time.
And is that how activists today view this push for a terrorism designation? Is the state trying to co-opt or weaponize the label?
That's exactly the argument many activists make, yes. They see the designation attempt as a political tool, a way for the government to demonize adversaries. Some argue that, from the state's perspective, anti-fascists who engage in direct action were always illegal because they challenged state authority and property norms.
Regardless of whether the police were perceived as dealing with the far-right threat effectively.
Right. They might say they're stepping in precisely because the state isn't stopping fascism, but that challenging role itself makes them a target for state repression, regardless of the label used. They see it as a tactic to neutralize political opposition.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this for you, the listener. We've tracked this trajectory from the organized, street-focused, militant anti-fascism of the British AFA, which had measurable success in physically disrupting groups like the BNP, to the modern, much looser, ideologically defined Antifa movement, primarily in the US, which is now embroiled in this high-stakes political battle over its very definition and legality. And that distinction between AFA, the organization, and Antifa, the ideology or movement, seems absolutely critical to understanding the current situation, doesn't it?
It really is. And the synthesis, I think, points to this recurring theme. Anti-fascism, whether it's a tightly organized group or a diffuse ideology, consistently gets framed by its opponents as a dangerous threat. Those opponents might be the far-right groups it directly confronts, or they might be state actors who see it as a challenge to their authority or social order. So the fight often becomes less about the actual threat level posed by, say, scattered groups of activists, and more about who holds the power to define the enemy and control political conflict.
Right. The power to label is immense. Which brings us to our final thought for you to consider. Something to mull over. We talked about East Germany using anti-fascism as a state tool, but let's go even further back and maybe stranger. There's a declassified CIA report from 1952. It mentions something called the Central Antifa School at Ogre.
Ogre, in what was then the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. According to this report, this wasn't a grassroots thing at all. It was a Soviet facility that allegedly trained around 2,000 people, including former prisoners of war, specifically for subversive actions targeting Western countries. The program was apparently called a policy of persuasion.
Wow. A state-run school training Antifa agents for subversion in the West. back in the 50s.
If the report is accurate, yes. So the
Yeah.
provocative question this leaves us with is this. Across different times and places, have the label anti-fascism served these dual, almost contradictory purposes? Has it been both a genuine bottom-up tool of resistance against real fascist threats and simultaneously a highly organized state-sponsored instrument used for espionage, political warfare, and propaganda?
That duality, grassroots resistance versus state tool, that really adds another layer of complexity to understanding this whole phenomenon.
We do a little trolling. It's
Something
called
to
We
think
Do a
about.
Little Trolling. We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling. We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really charged
do a little
topic.
trolling. It's
we
called
move
We Do
past
a
the
Little
headlines, the usual sound bites.
Yeah, we need to. We're aiming for a meticulous, critical investigation.
Our mission today is to trace the history, the tactics, and, crucially, the core ideology of the Antifa movement.
And it's absolutely vital we approach this critically. Because when you actually dig into the source material, and we've got quite a stack here,
We really do.
you know, everything from declassified Cold War intel, historical docs on European extremism, right up to detailed investigative reports on modern paramilitary groups, it becomes clear.
What becomes clear?
Well, that this story is much older and frankly far more complex than just, a reaction to current events.
Exactly. So the aim here isn't really to debate whether being anti-fascist is good or bad. That's not the point.
No, it's about investigation.
Right. We're investigating what these sources consistently seem to show. A movement that's defined by political extremism, by coordinated violence, and a pretty long-standing pattern of subversion. We're looking at the movement itself, not just the label.
And just to give you a taste of the kind of depth we're talking about today, we're going to be looking closely at, for instance, a 1952 CIA report.
1952.
Yeah, detailing a specific Soviet-run Central Antifa school, its purpose, subversion.
Wow.
And we're going to trace that lineage, that connection, directly through to the modern day, specifically the U.S. government's designation in September 2025 of Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization.
So this critical framing is really essential for the whole deep dive.
Yeah.
We're tracing a history that's consistently defined by confrontation.
That's the thread.
From its ideological roots in, interwar European extremism,
Yeah.
then through decades of militant street fighting in the UK.
Yeah, that's a key link.
And finally, how it shows up today. This sort of anonymous, chaos-focused force operating on American streets. Okay, let's unpack this history then. Starting with the name itself, Antifa. It's short for Antifaschistisch Action.
Nerman, yeah.
And its birth wasn't accidental, it was explicitly political. Right out of a period of really intense ideological street battles.
You have to go back to the Weimar Republic, specifically 1932. This was a time when the political center was just crumbling.
Total chaos.
Pretty much. The streets were dominated by highly organized political fighting groups, and Antifa, the term, was formally proclaimed that year by the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD.
The KPD, yeah.
And what the sources stress, it wasn't like a single fixed organization back then. It was more a call to a collective movement.
Right, but the KPD context is vital here. These weren't just like local activists.
No, absolutely not. They were militant Bolsheviks. They were operating under the direct, very strict influence of Moscow, the Comintern.
And following that Soviet line meant,
Yeah.
well, it meant their priorities were sometimes skewed, right?
Yeah, totally skewed. The KPD often saw the democratic socialists, the moderate parts of the Weimar government, who they actually called social fascists, as their biggest, most immediate threat.
More dangerous than the actual Nazis, in their view.
Often, yes. They prioritized fighting the democratic leftover, fighting the rising Nazi party. It seems unbelievable now, but that was the Moscow line.
And the symbolism they chose, that iconic logo with the two flags, that tells its own story, doesn't it? About the kind of alliance they wanted.
It does. The logo, designed by communist artists, shows two flags, red and black. You often see them tilted.
Red 4.
Socialism, communism, the KPD. And the black flag represents anarchism.
So it was meant to signify this united front of the far left revolutionary ideologies.
Exactly. A united front against the rise of National Socialism. At least that was the idea.
Okay, but here's where it gets, well, deeply ironic and tragic looking back at German history.
Yeah, huh?
The sources point out that this escalating far-left extremism, defined by constant street fighting, clashing with the Nazi street fighters, the SA.
The Sturmabteilung.
Right. That violence actually, coincidentally, helped the Nazis. How did that work?
Well, fundamentally, it just added to the relentless chaos. The constant violence, street battles, property damage, assassination attempts, it wore people down.
And undermined the government.
Exactly. It further delegitimized the political center, the democratic Weimar government. They looked weak, incapable of keeping order.
Trapped between two violent extremes.
Precisely. And for many ordinary Germans, just exhausted by the turmoil, the Nazis, with their promise of strong, decisive, singular authority, well, they started to look more appealing.
So the far-left extremism, ironically, fueled the conditions that helped the far-right rise.
It contributed significantly to the instability. That's what the historical analysis suggests. Hashtag 2.2. Antifa as a tool of the communist state.
Okay, so the story of anti-fascistic action doesn't just stop when Nazi Germany is defeated.
Not at all. After World War II, the whole concept, the idea of anti-fascism, gets co-opted. It gets functionalized by the Soviet sphere.
Functionalized? How so?
In a really cynical state-sponsored way. This is where Antifa shifts, from street politics towards statecraft, propaganda, even intelligence operations.
Right. Particularly in East Germany, the GDR.
Yes, absolutely. In the GDR, anti-fascism essentially became the state religion. It was baked into the national identity during the Cold War.
A state religion. That's a strong term. How did that manifest? What did they actually do with it?
It was this all-encompassing narrative. It served really three critical functions for the communist regime there.
Okay, what were they?
First, it legitimized the new state, the communist state, which wasn't democratic. They claimed they were the true historical heirs of the anti-fascist struggle.
So it gave them a kind of moral authority.
Supposedly. Second, and this is really crucial, it was used to basically exculpate the German population.
Exculpate? Like absolve them of guilt?
Pretty much. By insisting the regime itself was fundamentally anti-fascist, the vast majority of people could sort of distance themselves from collective responsibility for the Nazi era and just integrate into the new socialist state.
Wow. So the past just gets neatly repackaged.
Exactly. And third, strategically, it was used to externalize fascism. Fascism became something that belonged only to West Germany.
The enemy across the border.
Precisely. The communist state used relentless propaganda, branding the Western allies, the Americans, and their West German system as the worthy successors of the fascists.
So the entire history of National Socialism gets twisted.
Completely functionalized, made subservient to the immediate Cold War strategic interests of the Soviet Union. This whole cultural memory was deliberately constructed to integrate people and justify the regime's absolute power.
And this wasn't just about propaganda and history lessons. We have actual intelligence documents showing it went much deeper.
We do. This is where that CIA report comes in again.
Right, the 1952 report.
Yes, February 1952. It's direct evidence of state-sponsored subversion, the existence of this central Antifa school at Ogre.
Ogre, where's that?
In the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the USSR back then.
A Soviet training camp specifically for Antifa action. Okay, let's dig into that. The personnel, the curriculum.
Yeah.
What does the report say?
Well, the report details the command structure of this place. Ogre Central Training Camp number 2040. The headquarters staff included some pretty high-ranking intelligence figures.
I'll go.
An MVD officer, that's Soviet military intelligence, a Colonel Stabin, and also a KPD officer, a Captain Pinkelgas.
So Soviet intelligence and the German Communist Party running it together.
Jointly. Which really signals how important and how subversive this operation was considered.
Okay, and what were they teaching there? The report mentions about 400 students, mostly ex-POWs.
Yes, and the training wasn't just, political theory. It was specifically in subversive actions. They even had a name for it. The policy of permutation.
Policy of permutation. What did that actually involve on the ground? What kind of subversive actions?
Permutation was basically the playbook for deep, long-term communist subversion inside Western democracies. This wasn't training people how to protest on the streets.
No. What then?
It was training for sabotage, for infiltration. Graduates were assigned special missions back into the western zones of Germany.
Special missions like?
Things like practical training on how to live covertly, how to be a saboteur, how to identify and damage critical infrastructure.
Wow.
And, crucially, how to influence industrial workers, how to get them to participate in mass strikes, disruptive political demonstrations, using that unrest for political gain.
So these weren't activists in the way we might think today. These Antifa activists, trained by the Soviets, were essentially intelligence operatives.
That's what the evidence points to. Tasked with destabilizing civil society in the West, advancing Bolshevik goals, and using organized political disruption almost as cover.
That really does rewrite the popular history, doesn't it?
It certainly confirms that from that post-war period onwards, the Antifa label was directly tied to state-sponsored programs. Programs designed to sow chaos and subvert liberal democracies from the inside out.
Okay, so while the Soviets were busy co-opting this Antifa idea for state purposes, the original spirit, that sort of grassroots militant action, the physical confrontation part, that didn't die out.
No, it reemerged quite strongly, actually, but somewhere else. Half a continent away.
We need to shift focus now to the UK.
We do a little
to the
trolling.
tradition
It's
of what's
called we do a little
physical
trolling.
force anti-fascism.
Yeah, and the key group there is Anti-Fascist Action, or AFA. They formed in 1985.
And the UK
We do a little
AFA
trolling.
seems
It's
to
called
provide
we do a
a
little
really
trolling.
direct tactical blueprint for what we see later in the US, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They were very explicit about their mission, their own words, physical and ideological opposition to fascism. They basically formalized the doctrine that revolutionary politics needs violence.
Needs it for defense or
Both for defense and, more importantly, to seize the initiative, to go on the offensive.
They actually relaunched in 1989 as a sort of militant united front, didn't they? Targeting the working class specifically.
Yes, and emphasizing that the whole system, not just fascism, but the entire system, needed to be smashed. That was the language used. To stop fascism getting any foothold, it was always a radical anti-systemic vision from the start.
And their methods, well, even according to their own accounts, they were all about confrontation. Relentless confrontation.
Which often spilled over into outright criminality. The sources highlight the Liverpool AFA chapter as a prime example.
What did they do in Liverpool?
They were apparently quite successful, tactically speaking, in smashing into the ground again, their words, any attempts by the British National Party, the BNP, to hold public meetings or marches, basically making it physically impossible for them to organize publicly.
But the violence wasn't always just targeted at the BNP, was it? The sources mentioned things got messy.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. The violence became indiscriminate sometimes, or at least strategically confusing. The Liverpool sources are quite specific about this.
What do they say?
They describe a campaign of violence against targets that were not fascist, including, for example, a left-wing bookshop called News from Nowhere.
A left-wing bookshop.
Right.
Run by feminists.
Yes, run by a feminist collective. They suffered smashed windows in daylight attacks, even attempted arson.
Why would AFA attack a left-wing bookshop?
Well, that's the chilling part. The sources note that sometimes these attacks on non-fascist targets were actually claimed by the fascists themselves.
To sow confusion.
Exactly, to create more discord, to try and pin the blame elsewhere. It shows the kind of environment they fostered.
So an environment so dominated by physical force and criminality that the lines just blurred, and the main outcome was just destabilization.
Yeah.
Making any kind of organized politics difficult, regardless of ideology.
It seems that way. It became this inevitable war of attrition, but this total commitment to a strategy based purely on confrontation, it eventually led to its own problems.
Right, you mentioned ideological bankruptcy, decline. This happened in the mid-90s.
Yeah, the united front that AFA had built started to fracture pretty badly.
What caused the split? It sounds like it fell apart precisely when they tried to move beyond just street fighting.
That's largely it. The internal schism was fundamentally about political direction. There was a strong Marxist element, particularly a faction called Red Action.
Right.
Around 1995, they pushed hard for AFA to shift towards becoming a formal political party. They wanted to found something called the Independent Working Class Association, the IWCA.
Trying to get into electoral politics.
Right. And that attempt to engage with the system, with elections, was basically ideological poison for large parts of the movement.
What poison?
Because you had the anarchists, their whole philosophy is built on rejecting electoralism, rejecting the state structure entirely.
So joining the system was fundamentally against their core beliefs.
Absolutely. They were disgusted by it. The movement was built on this anarchist, anti-state foundation of pure physical opposition. Trying to become a political party directly contradicted that.
Leading to, what, mass defections?
Mass defections, apathy, internal fighting, the whole thing just crumbled.
That's a really key insight, especially for understanding the movement later on.
Right.
It was geared purely for fighting.
Right.
And it basically atrophied when its main opponent, the BNP, cleverly shifted their strategy away from street fights towards trying to win elections.
Exactly. AFA's whole reason for being, their raison d'etre, kind of evaporated when the fight moved from the streets to the ballot box.
Were there other factors in their decline?
Yeah, a few things. The police got better at understanding and countering AFA's tactics. There was also competition from other, sometimes better funded anti-fascist groups.
And just the sheer exhaustion.
Definitely. The heavy toll of attrition, constant arrests, serious injuries, the internal burnout that comes from trying to sustain a militant movement based purely on violence.
So the failure of the UK AFA really demonstrates something important, doesn't it?
I think so. It shows that a movement based only on confrontation without a positive political vision to build towards is inherently unstable. It's probably doomed to either decline or transform into something else entirely.
Okay, so that tradition of militant physical force anti-fascism, it didn't just vanish when the UK AFA declined.
No, it seems to have just sort of metastasized. It crossed the Atlantic, bringing that doctrine of confrontation directly into the American political scene.
And we can actually trace that line quite directly, can't we? From the UK AFA model, their networks.
Yeah, like the Northern network they had.
Yeah.
You can trace that lineage to the American experience. Many of the younger anarchists in the U.S. who follow this specific methodology are part of or came out of the Anti-Racist Action Network, ARA.
ARA. And the sources we looked at characterize ARA not just as, a community defense group reacting to things.
No, the framing in the investigative reports is different. They describe ARA as a national coalition of Antifa groups. And they call them the originators of organized, violent, left-wing street gangs in America.
Street gangs, that's strong language.
It is, but that framing is consistent. ARA and the groups that came after it explicitly confront neo-Nazis and racist skinheads on the street.
Which inevitably leads to violence.
It leads to predictable violence, yes. Their primary purpose, following that AFA doctrine we talked about, is physical confrontation. This pre-existing network essentially built the infrastructure for organized militant action here in the U.S.
An infrastructure that could then be activated when broader political situations, created opportunities for it.
Exactly. The foundation was already there.
Now, we really need to critically examine the narrative around Antifa's roots in the U.S. because you often hear attempts to link the movement to broader, maybe more legitimate protests.
Right. People try to sanitize the history a bit.
But when you look at the internal documents, the analysis by the extremists themselves, they hold up a completely different event as their benchmark for success.
They do. And it's a 1999 World Trade Organization conference in Seattle. The WTO riots.
1999. Why Seattle?
For the current generation of American anarchist extremists, the sheer level of rioting and disruption that happened around those WTO meetings, that is considered the gold standard. It was seen as a huge tactical victory.
A victory for chaos, basically.
Essentially, yes. And the consequences were massive. Millions upon millions of dollars in property damage, huge economic losses for the city.
And injuries, too.
Oh, yeah. Documented injuries to hundreds of law enforcement officers and bystanders caught in the middle, too.
And the key point here, strategically, was the chaos itself. Right. The sources mention that the number of people actually engaged in the violence and destruction, it was relatively small.
A very small fraction of the total number of protesters, maybe only a few hundred people at the absolute maximum, were involved in really violent stuff.
But they had an outsized impact.
Hugely outsized.
Yeah.
And that was seen as the strategic success that the movement internalized because the police response was so overwhelmed, so completely inadequate.
They ended up using tear gas indiscriminately.
Right, which affected everyone and just added to the chaos. So this small number of violent agitators managed to achieve maximum disruption. They basically shut down large parts of the city, damaged Seattle's reputation, and created public chaos far beyond what their numbers would suggest.
So this event effectively proved to anarchist extremists that creating widespread chaos, committing crimes, generating public disorder, it's a highly successful tactic.
Yes, successful for achieving their political aims specifically, demonstrating the failure of the existing system, the state, to maintain basic order.
It gave them proof of concept. Calculated disruption works, even with a small, dedicated core.
Exactly. It became the benchmark for planning future actions. The thinking became, if we could cause that much systemic failure with just a few hundred people back in '99, Imagine what we could achieve in a major city during, say, a summer of widespread unrest.
It set the template. Okay, so if the WTO riots set the standard for what success looks like, then the Black Bloc is probably the defining tactical method for the modern U.S. movement.
Definitely. It's all about anonymity and planned intimidation.
How does it work? Why the black clothing, the masks?
Well, the Black Bloc tactic is explicitly designed to conceal their identities. Everyone wears matching dark clothing, masks, helmets, anything to hide their face.
And the purpose is?
It's really twofold. First, it provides tactical anonymity. It makes it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to identify specific individuals who are committing acts of violence or property damage.
Safety in the crowd, basically.
And second, it creates this visual effect, a uniform, de-individualized mass. It looks far more intimidating, far more cohesive than just a random group of people. It projects strength and threat.
And the sources are pretty clear that these confrontations involving black blocs aren't usually spontaneous. They're often planned, almost militarized events.
Yeah, the 2017 DC inauguration protests are a perfect example documented in the reports. You had a black bloc, maybe 200 or more people.
Right.
They formed a specific line. They initiated a countdown, and then they charged a police line that was vastly outnumbered fewer than 24 officers.
Charging the police line.
Yes. And they weren't just, pushing. They were armed. The reports mention hammers, crowbars, wooden sticks, and other weapons.
So that's not defense. That's a calculated attempt to overwhelm law enforcement through organized, armed confrontation.
It certainly appears that way from the documentation.
Furthermore, the violence isn't just directed at police or property. It seems to be politically targeted too, used to silence opposition, not just clash with, say, the far right.
The documentation on this is quite clear, yes. This isn't random street brawling. It's often specific ideological targeting.
Could you give some examples from the sources?
Sure. There's the well-known case of the conservative journalist Andy Ngo in Portland, June 2019.
Right, I remember that.
He was physically attacked, quite severely, while covering demonstrations. He ended up hospitalized. That looks like a targeted attack on media perceived as hostile to the movement.
Silencing critics.
Potentially. Then there's Louisville, September 2020. Sources document individuals distributing riot gear, shields, masks, even a sign with an Antifa symbol out of a moving truck.
Handing out equipment.
Yes, hours before riots erupted that same day, which unfortunately resulted in 2 police officers being shot. This suggests premeditation, coordination, and supplying equipment for violent action.
In Berkeley, there were incidents there too.
Berkeley, in 2017, both February and August, defined by black-clad agitators causing, estimates say, around $100,000 in property damage, and physically assaulting multiple people, including, the reports specifically note, at least one person targeted purely because of his perceived conservative political beliefs.
So direct political targeting.
It appears so. And the intimidation tactics go beyond just physical street confrontations. There's the whole digital side, too.
You mean doxing?
Exactly. Doxing is a primary psychological weapon for them. In June 2018, there was an Antifa-linked Twitter account.
Yeah.
It publicly posted the names and home addresses of over 1,500 Immigration and Customs Enforcement employees, ICE agents.
1,500. Their home addresses.
Yes. And the explicit intent, which led to widespread harassment of those individuals and their families, was clearly to generate terror, fear, and disruption.
Targeting government agents, law enforcement, people representing the state.
Right. The goal seems to be to make the personal cost of working for the state, of enforcing laws they oppose, just too high, to intimidate people out of doing their jobs.
Okay, so given this pattern we've discussed, organized, politically motivated, violence, intimidation, targeting, we have to look at the most significant response from the state.
Which was?
The U.S. government's designation of Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. That happened in September 2025.
Right. Now, that designation was controversial, particularly in how it was announced.
Via Executive Order and Truth Social, wasn't it?
Yes, which highlighted the political aspect. But the justification itself, the reasoning provided by the Trump administration, gives the strongest official assessment of how the government views a legend.
And how did they frame it? What was the core justification?
They defined Antifa quite starkly as a militarist, anarchist enterprise, one that explicitly calls for the overthrow of the United States government, law enforcement authorities, and our system of law.
So focusing squarely on the anti-state, anti-system goals. But how did they connect Antifa's actions to the legal definition of domestic terrorism?
Well, they stress that the movement's coordinated violence, the intimidation tactics, the obstruction efforts, that these align specifically with the federal definition.
Which is?
Activities occurring primarily within the U.S. that involve acts dangerous to human life, carried out with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence government policy by intimidation or coercion, or affect government conduct by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping.
So they argued the violence wasn't random, it had a political purpose.
Exactly. The justification detailed what they saw as a systematic use of illegal means to organize and execute a campaign of violence across the country, citing organized riots, armed standoffs with federal officers, violent assaults on police. The aim was to demonstrate that political motivation behind the violence.
But as you said, the legal side was tricky. The U.S. legal system seemed to struggle with this. Why exactly is there currently no legal basis to formally designate a domestic group as terrorist, unlike foreign ones?
It really comes down to the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of association.
How so?
Well, the government can designate foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, without running into U.S. constitutional issues. But designating a domestic group that raises huge concerns about potentially criminalizing political speech or association.
So you could punish the actions, but not label the group itself.
That's the tension. Former senior Justice Department officials pointed this out. Any formal designation of a domestic group would raise significant First Amendment concerns. The government can prosecute the acts of domestic terrorism using existing criminal laws, arson, assault, conspiracy, etc. But formally branding a whole political group or idea as inherently terrorist is a much bigger, constitutionally fraught step.
Which is why the declaration came via executive order and social media, not through established legal channels for designating terrorist organizations.
Precisely. It functioned more as a political statement about the perceived nature and severity of the threat, acknowledging the legal hurdles to actually designating the organization itself in the same way FTOs are designated.
It signaled intent, regardless of the immediate legal mechanism.
Right. And interestingly, how did the anarchist sources themselves react to this? How did they interpret this move by the state?
Well, predictably, they saw it as a calculated political weapon.
A distraction.
Yeah, they called it a distraction piece. Something designed to demonize political opponents, rally conservative support. Their argument was that this designation was just a pretext.
Pretext for what?
To legitimize a maximum force response. Not just against the Black Bloc activists engaged in violence, but against all dissenting elements, all anarchists, anyone opposing the state. Their view is essentially, the state always sauces a terrorist anyway. This just makes it official and justifies cracking down harder. Hashtag 4.2. Critiquing the media narrative. Okay, the public perception of Antifa has been, well, all over the place. Massively contentious. We really need to spend some time dissecting the media narrative around the group, especially the years leading up to that 2025 designation.
Yeah, the media's role in shaping how people understood Antifa is absolutely central to the whole story, and frankly, central to the confusion.
How so?
Well, for years, particularly, from maybe 2017 onwards, many outlets, especially on the political left, tended to downplay the movement.
Downplay the violence.
Downplay the violence, downplay the organization. You heard rhetoric claiming that warnings about Antifa were greatly exaggerated, or the famous line that it's just an idea, not really a group.
Which helped portray them as what? Quirky idealists. A fringe nuisance.
Something like that. It minimized the perception of threat.
But the sources we've looked at, the investigative reports, they paint a different picture. They confirm that while Antifa isn't some monolithic, centrally controlled organization with membership cards.
Right. It's not like that.
It's definitely more than just an idea. It's described as a loose affiliation of local activist groups, right? Militant groups scattered across the country.
Who adheres to a shared tactical doctrine, that Black Bloc approach we discussed, and share a common ideological goal, which is fundamentally anti-state action.
So it's organized, just not hierarchical in a traditional sense.
Exactly. And the difficulty in pinning down their true organizational scope, that's highlighted even in conflicting intelligence reports.
Oh, so?
Well, you have things like that internal FBI memo from June 2020, which found no intelligence indicating Antifa involvement in certain specific protests that summer.
And that gets cited a lot by people saying the threat is overblown.
It does, but then that conflicts directly with the on-the-ground reality reported by police during major unrest.
Like in Seattle.
It's like in Seattle, Portland, other places, where police estimates consistently put the number of people engaged in coordinated property, crime, arson, assaults on officers the black bloc tactics in the few hundred range during specific events.
So why the discrepancy? Why couldn't the FBI always confirm involvement?
It points to the core challenge for intelligence agencies. The structure is decentralized. And crucially, there's the pervasive anonymity of the black bloc.
Masks, same clothes, burner phones.
Exactly. When the perpetrators deliberately conceal their identities and use encrypted or burner communications, proving a direct organizational structure or top-down coordination for specific criminal acts becomes incredibly difficult for investigators.
They leverage that low visibility, that anonymity.
It's key to their operational security. It helps them maintain distance from formal prosecution as an organization.
So the media's failure, perhaps, to critically assess
do a little
all the
trolling.
available
It's
source
called we
material,
do a little
including police
trolling.
reports and historical context, that often contributed to the confusion, painting the violence as spontaneous, localized reactions.
It
We do a
seems
little
that way.
trolling.
Instead
It's
of seeing
called
it
we
as
do a
the
little
culmination of this longer militant tradition we've traced.
And that strategic ambiguity, being just an idea when it's convenient, but then appearing as a highly coordinated, almost military-style bloc when necessary.
That's arguably the core tactical genius, if you want to call it that, of the modern movement. It makes them very hard to define and counter.
Which brings us back really to the fundamental question we started with. Is that anti-fascist label? Is it just a cover, a strategic misnomer for something much more radical, something fundamentally anti-Western?
Based on the evidence, the tactics, the targets, the historical lineage, the argument that the label is primarily strategic seems very strong.
Because the underlying ideology isn't just about stopping fascists.
No, it's rooted in anarchist extremism, and that philosophy explicitly calls for the dismantling of the existing social order.
Through it, me.
Through anti-capitalism, anti-globalism, even a kind of radical anti-urbanization in some strains. It's about overthrowing the whole system.
And their choice of targets seems to bear that out, doesn't it? They don't only go after far-right groups or rallies.
Not at all. They systematically target what they see as symbols of Western civilization, things they perceive as the root causes of society's problems.
Rather than just focusing on specific political opponents.
Right. The focus is broader. It's systemic destabilization. Look at the targets listed in the reports. Financial corporations, government buildings, multinational companies, police stations, law enforcement officers themselves.
Things representing capitalism, the state, globalization.
Exactly. The documented intent often seems to be damaging and vandalizing property, rioting, violently disrupting the functioning of the existing capitalist state structure. The method is consistent. Create chaos to destabilize the system and silence political opposition of all kinds.
And if we look at the campaigns mentioned in some of the more recent sources, like Antifa International, that broadens the picture even more, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows that fighting the local far right is often secondary now to a much wider radical agenda.
What kind of campaigns are they involved in internationally?
Well, the sources mention transnational campaigns like Defend Refugees, Stop the Far Right. That's still there, but also, very tellingly, things like a week of action against Israel's F-35 genocide jets.
Okay, so that clearly goes far beyond just local street fighting against neo-Nazis.
Absolutely. It shows the movement has expanded its focus. It embraces a whole range of radical, anti-Western, anti-globalist causes.
So when you put it all together, the consistent use of violence, the doxing, the anonymity, combined with these really broad ideological targets.
Yeah, it strongly suggests that the movement's true goal isn't merely stopping fascism in the traditional sense. It's about advancing a radical anarchist agenda.
An agenda achieved by destabilizing civil society and silencing all political opposition, using physical force and intimidation as the primary tools.
That appears to be the logical conclusion based on the patterns of action and the stated aims found in the source materials. So if we were to synthesize the key findings from this deep dive, Antifa clearly isn't just some spontaneous modern trend.
No, the history is deep.
It's a militant movement with a history of subversion, with documented roots tied back to communist intelligence operations in the post-war era.
And its modern form relies on specific tactics.
Yes, it uses organized violence, tactical anonymity, that's the black bloc, and political intimidation methods like doxing. And all of this seems directed towards achieving radical political goals.
Goals that go way beyond just opposing fascism.
Right. They seem to aim for the total dismantling of the state, of capitalism, and of core Western institutions.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've laid out this documented historical pattern: coordinated violence, clear ideological opposition to the U.S. system of law.
A consistent pattern over decades, adapted to new contexts.
So given the severity of these actions, actions which seem to align pretty clearly with the definition of politically motivated violence designed to achieve a political end, does the formal legal status, that whole debate around the domestic terrorist organization designation, does it actually matter in defining the threat?
Or does the nature of their actions, the history of their actions, already define them regardless of the legal label? That's something to think about.
Yeah.
And the sources really drive home that connection we discussed earlier. The violence, the ideology, it's deeply rooted in the history of European radical political parties and their tradition of militant street action.
So the final thought, the takeaway for you to consider, might be this. What does this historical connection tell us? This link between far-left ideological goals like dismantling the state and the seemingly inevitable turn towards coordinated physical force, towards subversion, when groups try to achieve those revolutionary ends outside of the democratic or electoral process.
It's a recurring pattern worth examining closely. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into something pretty charged. Anti-fascist action, Antifa. We've got a stack of sources here. And they're really all over the map. Everything from a detailed histories by activists involved in street fights back in the UK, right up to recent U.S. government orders trying to label the modern movement a terrorist threat. So our mission, as always, is to try and pull these conflicting stories apart and, synthesize the key stuff for you, staying impartial.
Exactly. And the real puzzle here is, how does a movement that's so loosely affiliated, people involved often just call it an idea.
Yeah.
How does that become the focus of a huge national security debate? We're going to trace it from its pretty organized militant beginnings in Britain through to its modern, more ideological form. And we'll look at the clashes over its tactics and even its legal status.
Okay, let's get into that history then. We actually start in Britain, not the U.S., with Anti-Fascist Action, or AFA. They were mainly active, 1985 to about 2001?
That's right. And they were consciously following an older British tradition of militant anti-fascism. Think back to the 1930s, the Battle of Cable Street. AFA formed specifically to take on groups like the British National Party, the BNP.
And when you say take on, what did that actually look like?
Well, their approach was defined as physical and ideological opposition to fascism. The groups they were targeting, like the BNP, weren't just holding meetings. They were actively selling racist papers on the streets, attacking minorities, attacking left-wing places.
Like that bookshop mentioned in the sources.
Yeah, the News from Nowhere bookshop in Liverpool is a known target. So AFA wasn't just about debating ideas, it was about physically stopping fascist activity.
And the sources suggest they were pretty effective, at least in some places. Liverpool comes up specifically.
It does. Apparently, the local BNP had been quite active, despite local opposition. But AFA's direct action tactics there were, decisive. We found this quote from the Liverpool BNP themselves, admitting they were, and this is their words, driven underground by left-wing extremists in the mid-'80s.
Wow. Driven underground. That's direct.
It was a deliberate shutdown. And it speaks to how AFA organized. They called it a militant united front. Intentionally broad, mostly anarchists and Marxists, people from groups like Red Action.
What held such different groups together in a united front?
The key thing was what they called the class perspective. The core belief was that fascism fundamentally aims to destroy working class power. Therefore, only the working class, organized and willing to fight, could truly defeat it. That was the ideological glue.
And they really did mobilize, didn't they? The sources talk about some major confrontations.
Oh yeah, this was their peak. They deliberately went where fascist groups were trying to gain ground or legitimacy, like Remembrance Sunday events challenging the National Front and BNP at the Cenotaph in London or Clifford's Tower in York.
Which has that historical resonance, the site of a medieval Jewish massacre.
Exactly. Showing up there was a direct challenge. And they had successes. They effectively smashed the Nazi music network, Blood and Honor, stopping their street sales and gigs around 1989.
And then there was the Battle of Waterloo in 92.
Right, a huge mobilization. The sources say over 1,000 anti-fascists turned up. It shows they were absolutely serious about controlling public space through physical presence and, confrontation.
Okay, but that raises a crucial question. If they were so effective on the streets, why did AFA eventually decline? Did that focus on physical action have limits?
It seems so. The sources point to a breakdown of that united front starting in the mid-'90s. It wasn't just one thing, but but a major factor was a fundamental disagreement about
We do
strategy.
a little trolling. It's called
Yeah,
we do a little
there were
trolling.
issues, like some anarchist groups falling out with Searchlight magazine, accusing them of being too close to police intelligence, special branch. But the
We
big
do a little
split, the really
trolling. It's
decisive
called
one,
we
was
do a
about
little trolling.
politics, specifically electoral politics.
Ah, right. This is the IWCA thing, the Independent Working Class Association.
Exactly.
We do a
After
little
the BNP
trolling. It's
actually
called we
managed
do a
to
little
win a
trolling.
local council seat in East London in 1993, one faction within AFA, led by Red Action, argued that street
We do a
fighting
little
wasn't
trolling.
enough.
It's called we
They
do a
said,
little
"Look,
trolling."
we need a political alternative. We need to stand for election."
And that didn't sit well with everyone.
Not at all. It basically tore the United Front apart. Many core AFA activists were fundamentally anti-electoral, anarchists especially. Others argued that AFA's strength was its single focus on direct action. Endorsing any political party would break that unity.
So the move towards trying to build an electoral party actually undermined the very thing that made AFA strong in the first place.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And other factors chipped away too. The police definitely got better at handling their tactics. Activists got older, had families, maybe just couldn't sustain that level of confrontation. Plus, you had competition from other groups, like the relaunched Anti-Nazi League, which had more resources.
So AFA's centralized confrontational model eventually just couldn't hold. Which brings us across the pond and forward in time to Antifa as we hear about it today. How does that connect, and where did that specific name come from?
Well, the name Antifa itself is actually much older than British AFA. It's short for the German Antifaschistische Action.
Anti-fascist action.
Right. It was first used by the German Communist Party way back in 1932 as a banner to rally opposition against Hitler and the Nazis.
Okay, so the name has historical roots, but how is today's Antifa different from the organized British AFA we were just discussing?
And that's the crucial difference. Today, Antifa is generally understood as an umbrella term. It describes a far-left, anti-fascist political movement. It's characterized as a loose affiliation of local activists.
Right.
Critically, it has no designated leadership, no central organization like AFA had.
So it's more of an ideology, a set of practices, than a group you can join.
Exactly, which makes it fundamentally different to police or engage with. You can't just arrest the leader because there isn't one.
And the symbolism reflects that broad church, right? The famous logo.
Yeah, the two flags logo, one red for socialism or communism, one black for anarchism flying together. It visually represents that coalition, that umbrella aspect of the modern movement. Different far-left tendencies united against fascism.
Okay, this is where things often get heated in public discussion. The tactics.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the black bloc. What's the idea behind dressing in all black and covering faces?
The black bloc is a tactic, not a group itself. Activists wear black, use masks, bandanas, hoods, whatever conceals identity. The strategic purpose is twofold. One, anonymity. It makes it harder for law enforcement to identify individuals, especially if property destruction or clashes occur.
Like during the Trump inauguration protests in D.C. in 2017.
Precisely. That was a very visible example. Two, it creates a sense of unity and visual force. A uniform, anonymous bloc can appear quite intimidating. Sometimes individuals within the bloc might carry improvised weapons too.
And beyond street tactics, there's the digital side, like doxing.
Correct. Doxing is publishing someone's private information, online address, workplace, phone number, usually to expose them to harassment, get them fired, or generally disrupt their lives. It's been used against alleged white supremacists, for instance.
There was that case at the University of Nebraska, Omaha mentioned.
Yes. And on a larger scale, there was the incident in 2018 where an account linked to Antifa reportedly shared personal details of over 1,500 ICE employees. The goal there is clearly to intimidate and hinder the agency's work.
And for some activists, that level of disruption is seen as a measure of success, referencing the 1999 Seattle WTO protests.
For some anarchist extremists, yes. The massive property damage and disruption caused in Seattle back in '99 is sometimes held up as a benchmark, the so-called Seattle Standard, for successful direct action against state or corporate power.
Now, just quickly before we move to the terrorism designation debate, the sources mentioned something called national anarchists. What's that about? It sounds like a contradiction.
It is. It's a very fringe ideology, but worth noting.
Yeah.
Groups like BANA in California apparently try to use entryism, adopting the language and symbols of anarchism, environmentalism, anti-globalization, but for completely opposite goals.
So using the language to mask,
White nationalism, basically. Racial separatism, wanting whites-only enclaves, which they term national autonomous zones. It's an attempt to co-opt anarchist aesthetics for far-right white supremacist ends. A fringe but confusing element.
Okay, right. So bearing all that complexity in mind, the loose structure, the mix of tactics, the ideological branding, how did we get to the point where the U.S. government was seriously trying to designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization?
Well, the political pressure ramped up significantly, especially around the protests in 2020.
We do a little trolling.
The Trump
It's called we
administration,
do a
in
little
particular,
trolling.
repeatedly blamed Antifa for violence and unrest. This culminated in an executive order signed in September 2025, according to our source here.
And what did that order actually say Antifa was?
It described Antifa in pretty stark terms, a militarist anarchist enterprise that, it claimed, explicitly seeks the overthrow of the U.S. government. It accused the movement of using violence, obstructing federal law, specifically citing attacks on ICE officers, and actively recruiting and training people to achieve its aims through coercion and intimidation.
That sounds very specific, like describing an actual organization. But given what we've said about Antifa being a loose movement, how did the legal side of that stack up? Can the U.S. government even designate a domestic group like that?
That's the core legal problem. Unlike with foreign terrorist organizations, there's currently no analogous mechanism in U.S. law to formally designate a domestic group. Legal experts, including former senior Justice Department officials, warn that doing so would raise huge, significant First Amendment concerns.
Because you'd essentially be outlawing an ideology or a political viewpoint rather than a specific group with a clear structure.
Precisely. Where do you draw the line? Who is in Antifa if there's no membership list? It becomes constitutionally very problematic.
And what about the intelligence? Did law enforcement actually find clear evidence that Antifa was the main driver of the violence in 2020, as was being claimed?
Well, the picture is more complicated than the political rhetoric suggested. Our sources mention an FBI report from the Washington field office in June 2020, which stated it had no intelligence indicating Antifa involvement in certain violent incidents during the George Floyd protests.
Really? So who did they think was involved?
Interestingly, the same intelligence reports did warn about far-right extremists, saying they had called for far-right provocateurs to attack federal agents and use weapons against protesters. So the intelligence picture on who was actually instigating violence seems much more mixed and contested than just blaming Antifa.
So the designation push faced legal hurdles and maybe wasn't fully supported by intelligence assessments.
Right. And this brings us back to history, in a way. This idea of the state defining and trying to dismantle or control an anti-fascist movement. It's not entirely new.
You're thinking about how states have sometimes used anti-fascism for their own purposes, like in East Germany, the GDR.
Exactly. In the GDR, anti-fascism wasn't just a grassroots sentiment. It became a central element of the state's official identity. It was almost a state religion, a propaganda tool.
How did they use it?
They used it to legitimize the socialist state, claiming they were the true anti-fascists, while painting West Germany and the West generally as inheritors of fascism. It helped justify the Berlin Wall, control internal dissent labeling dissidents as fascists, and generally bolster their position in the Cold War. It was highly functionalized.
And that framework, seeing the anti-fascist label used as a political tool by the state, is kind of how activists today view the terrorism designation attempt, isn't it?
Very much so. From their perspective, as cited in our sources, the designation attempt is a political tool, maybe even a distraction piece. They argue governments use it to demonize adversaries.
Their view being that genuine anti-fascist action is always seen as inherently threatening by the state.
Right. They'd say anti-fascists were always illegal in the eyes of the state because their actions challenge the established order, challenge police authority, especially if they feel the police aren't adequately dealing with far-right threats themselves. They see the designation as a political move to shut down opposition.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this for everyone listening. We've traced this arc from a quite organized militant group, AFA in the UK, that had real success driving fascists off the streets locally.
But ultimately fractured due to internal politics and changing conditions.
You're the modern Antifa phenomenon, a decentralized ideological movement or banner in the US using different tactics, which then becomes the focus of this intense political battle over whether it's a domestic terrorist threat. That difference between AFA, the organization, and Antifa, the idea, seems critical.
It really is. What emerges from the sources is that anti-fascism, whether it's organized like AFA or more of a diffuse movement like Antifa, consistently gets framed by its opponents, be they actual far-right groups or state authorities, as a dangerous threat that needs controlling, dismantling, or sometimes, like in the GDR, co-opting for state purposes. So the fight often seems less about the precise level of threat posed by, scattered groups of activists, and more about the political power to define who the enemy is and what forms of political action are considered legitimate.
That leads perfectly into our final provocative thought for you. We talked about East Germany using anti-fascism as a state tool. But let's go even further back and into murkier territory. We found a declassified CIA report from 1952.
And it mentioned something called the Central Antifa School at Ogur, apparently located in what was then the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Ogur, Latvia. What was happening there, according to the CIA?
The report claims this school trained around 2,000 people, including former prisoners of war, specifically for subversive actions targeting Western countries. The program was apparently called a policy of persuasion.
Policies of persuasion, training people in Antifa tactics for subversion in the West, run by the Soviets in the early Cold War.
Exactly. So the question to leave you with is this. Across different times and places, has the label anti-fascism served a dual purpose? On the one hand, a genuine grassroots tool for resistance against real fascist threats, like AFA against the BNP, but on the other hand, has it also been at times a highly organized, state-sponsored instrument for espionage, political warfare, and subversion?
That potential duality, grassroots resistance versus state weapon, really adds another layer of complexity to understanding this whole phenomenon, doesn't it? Something to think about.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex source stacks, often polarized, and boil them down into the key insights for you. Today we're digging into a movement that's been around for decades, but has really hit the headlines recently. Anti-fascist action, often known now as Antifa. Our sources are, well, they're quite something. We've got everything from these really detailed, gritty accounts by activists in the UK back in the 80s and 90s, all the way up to current U.S. government documents, even executive orders trying to label the modern movement as domestic terrorists. So our job here is to unpack these clashing stories, look at the history, the structure, the controversies, and just lay out the different perspectives impartially for you.
Yeah, and the real puzzle, the core tension we're trying to get at is how does this kind of loosely connected social movement, people involved often say it's more an idea than an organization. How does that become the target of a major, executive level national security debate? So we'll trace it from its pretty organized and militant roots in Britain to the modern, much more decentralized form, and look at these really conflicting views on its tactics and its legal status.
Okay, let's start with that history then. Not in the U.S., but